Chapter 21. Finding a Way. Roland was sitting down on a bench outside a certain building. This was the fifth he had visited today, and the sun was already setting. He had gone through the city while trying to find himself a place to work. The first place wanted to make him sign a 6-year contract that felt more like a scam than anything else. He decided to continue with his search, but what he found later was quite shocking. The first contract given was on the better side. The other places wanted to keep him there for longer. The terms were similar, and the pay varied. Some wanted him to make a certain number of scrolls each day. Others wanted him to work for a fixed amount of hours for the entire week. He wouldn't even have days off. I made a big mistake. He thought that a big city like this would have many opportunities. He was sure that he would find something sooner or later. The reality was different. The store owners were all in cahoots. They made it hard for any new talent to get a good start. A new scribe wouldn't be able to earn any money at all. The prices of the materials were set so that only intermediate-level spell scrolls would actually bring him profit. He didn't even know if they would buy scrolls from a third party like him or if they gave them a fair price. Probably not. Roland was now thinking that a smaller town might have been a better choice. They would probably offer him a less binding contract, one without a curse. The curse was also one that lowered your mana by 60% until the contract time ran out. For a mage, something like that would be crippling. Losing more than half of your mana pool would halt your progress dramatically. His plan was to work as a scribe for a year or so. With his experience gaining trick, he had reason to believe that he could reach L25 of this class by then. He figured that getting enough money for a class change crystal wouldn't be that hard. He even had enough right now. The reality was different though. No one from the established shops would let him test his skills in their shops for free. He would need to pay up and close to slave labor. He had assumed too much. He thought that a mage class was a rare commodity. He thought that when the store owners heard that he was a mana scribe, they would spread their arms wide and invite him in, no questions asked. He had underestimated how businesses operated here, and that they already had a system in place. Most of the scribes were kids from the magic academies. These academies were able to get better contracts for their students that were only working to level up and gain new skills for their future. If you were a solo act, the contracts were much harsher, as they didn't really care about you as a worker. Why would they if they got cheap labor from the magic academies instead? What are my other options besides signing one of those contracts? The youth looked out into the distance. The horizon was all red as the sun was setting. He could even see some priests from the Sun Church praising the sun and doing some strange pose with their arms outstretched into the air. He could take the contract and work hard for those 5 or 6 years. He would probably gain a lot of experience through scribing and reach max level. He could hold out on using the schematics trick until he got to the blacksmith class if it showed promise. Problem was that he wouldn't really be able to focus on his smithing work. Some of the contracts even forbade part-time work at other places. He also feared that the smithing workshops could have similar agreements. Another option was leaving the city and finding one without that many scribes. Maybe in a place where his class was rare, the shop owners would be more lenient. Still, he had no idea if they wouldn't just give him similar contracts, or where a city like that existed. He also considered moving to a city with a dungeon and just doing scribe work on the side. That option would probably slow his leveling down as crafting classes gained less experience by slaying monsters. Is there a place I can sell my items in here? Roland had access to his debugging skill, so he could probably upgrade those runic spell scrolls to the highest rating. He thought back to the prices those went for, and they overshadowed the regular spell scrolls. Problem was that no one was willing to buy them if they could get something cheaper in bulk that wasn't that much worse. How much better were the highest versions of those runic spells? Was the biggest question. If he managed to get that fire arrow spell to be a lot more powerful than the competition's, he might be able to somehow do it. The construction materials weren't that costly. Maybe if he bundled them 10 apiece he could manage to scrape by. There was another problem besides that. How would he explain that a boy of not even 11 was selling and producing runic spell scrolls at the highest rank? Would the people try to get his secrets? Would they get violent? He wasn't sure how the businessmen around here reacted to the unwanted competition. He didn't think he would affect their bottom line with some scrolls, so he mostly thought it would be safe in that regard. Was there a place that he could sell his stuff without attracting attention, while still earning enough to get by and while leveling up? He didn't think there was such a convenient place in the regular stores or shops. Should he try peddling it out in the market, while hiding his face behind his robe hood? He remembered that there was one type of place that he could sell items like that. Such a place was an auction house. He could probably remain somewhat anonymous. The auction houses probably kept the seller's name secret. This was probably one of the better options out on the table. I should head back to the inn. I'll try to scribe some regular spells first. I'll think about it later. He had enough for today. He couldn't make up his mind, and the sun had already gone down. He could still work for an hour or two on his scroll making, then at least this day wouldn't be a total waste. Roland hopped down from the bench he was sitting on. It was nicely made from some kind of metal, probably fashioned in place by some kind of smith or artisan. He took out an apple from his storage bag and bit into it. It was nice and sweet and worth the coin that he paid for it. He wasn't in a hurry as he just walked forward. He looked at the people going back and forth. In the middle of the road there were horse carriages passing by. Some of them were even pulled by some large ox-looking creatures. The people chatted with each other, and they looked to be going to the taverns for some alcohol. People in this world sure like to drink. He attributed this feature to them not having any TV or internet here. There weren't that many places for people to spend their free time. There were some theaters, but those were mostly occupied by the rich merchants and nobles, while the commoners liked louder places like casinos or the aforementioned taverns. There was also the red light district, where men liked to spend their coins on the various ladies of the diverse races. Before his mind could wander to strange places, he got brought back into reality. He heard someone ringing a loud bell, and this person wasn't part of the Sun Church. After glancing towards the direction of the noise, he noticed quite the curvy elf lady. She wasn't the same one that he saw last time, and she was even more beautiful. She was clearly dressed to show off, and to pull in the attention of the crowds. She had something akin to those Chinese dresses with a lot of leg space. She was ringing that bell in front of a large gate. Above it, a picture of a scale. "Gather up, good people of Edelgard. The Libra auction house will be opening in half an hour. Be sure to bring your purses, as we will be having a grand auction today." She continued talking while Roland spaced out for a moment. He didn't realize that there was this kind of establishment in the area. He inched forward together with the small group of people that was lured in by the bouncy elven girl. "Step right in. The entrance fee is only 2 small silver, practically nothing." After hearing that they actually had to pay to get in, most of the people dispersed while grumbling. Roland and a few others remained. Some of them even paid the price and went in. He was hesitant as he didn't want to buy anything from there. He would rather sell his scrolls there, but he didn't even have any items to show. He was just looking for an auction house to sell his wares, and one popped out. He was surprised that they were taking entrance fees. He thought that the more buyers the better. Why would you limit your earning potential? This was just a way to weed out people that were only there to window shop. If someone actually paid a small entrance fee, they would be more inclined to spend more inside. It would feel like a waste to partake in the auction, pay an entrance fee, and not get anything in return. It was also a strategy to keep the poor out and attract the rich. He pulled out the map of the area and made sure to mark it down. From what he knew of such places, they took in stock during the day and sold them later at night, just like now. He would return here another time with some items in tow. For now, he decided to return back to the inn he was staying at. He needed to test his scribing skills, and in the morning go buy some of those runic spell scrolls that he saw. Back in his room, he pulled out one of the special scrolls made from monster skin. It had a yellow tint to it, and was rough around the edges. He placed the inkwell that he bought from the store on his small table along with a new quill. He was already a couple of large silver coins poorer after buying some of these supplies. "I hope this pays off," he grumbled under his nose, hoping for the best. First, he needed to practice. He would be focusing on runic spell scrolls, but he wanted to at least go through the process of scribing a regular spell scroll. His aim was his mana arrow spell, the strongest attacking spell that he had. His basic mana scribing skill was at L1, so he wasn't expecting any grand results. He also wanted to check how much experience he would get from making one. Source of all magic, heed my call. The process of mana scribing was a bit different than the runic counterpart. The scribe had to write down the spell onto the scroll while focusing his mana on the quill and ink. There were no intricate lines or runic components to slow him down. He just needed to spell out the right incantation onto paper in the correct language while focusing. The mana arrow's incantation wasn't all that long or difficult, but putting ink to paper while focusing your mana was still difficult. After 10 minutes, he managed to get his first spell scroll, and he heard the notification. "You have gained 20 experience points." He rubbed his chin afterward. This amount of experience wasn't all that great. It also wasn't that bad either if you took into consideration that he could do it from the safety of his home. A warrior could probably hunt down monsters faster in a shorter span of time, but a scribe wasn't put into any danger while crafting. He could also do it continuously if he had the materials and mana. He tried identifying his own spell scroll, but besides getting its name there weren't any further stats. Maybe if he leveled up his scribing skill, he would be able to examine the scrolls and get their rank and damage value. How much will I get from a simple runic spell? He was now curious. He needed to compare the two. The problem was that he only had the knowledge of 3 runes, and 2 of them weren't really fit to be scribed down as they were made for weapons. He decided on the fire orb rune as it was also a lot easier to scribe down. He went through the motions while remembering his class change quests. This was already the 3rd time he was drawing this rune, so he had some practice. His fingers grasped the quill, and his hand moved slowly. The intricate runic symbols started to slowly appear on the yellow scroll as they connected into one complete runic spell. "You have gained 50 experience points." It took him about 45 minutes to finish. This was already faster than before, but it still was a lot slower than with the regular scribing skill. He had gained more than double the experience, but needed a lot more time to do it. He quickly looked at the scroll before him and ran it through his debugging skill. To no surprise, he saw some red lines. It was one thing to know where the mistakes were and another to actually bring it to paper. Even if he didn't want it, his hands weren't steady, his mana control wasn't perfect, and his concentration wavered from time to time. He just couldn't redraw the perfect diagram at his current skill level. He would need to practice before he could actually sell any of these personally made goods. He came to a conclusion: making runic scrolls wasn't optimal for gaining experience points. He could probably make 5 regular spell scrolls and gain 100 XP, while making one runic version gave him 50 XP. This wasn't a problem for him, though, as he could just make some schematics to even it out. What he wanted at this time was to earn more gold, and he felt like the runic spells were the way to go. There was also another discovery that he made. His debugging skill wasn't working on the regular spell scrolls. There were no lines, he just couldn't see anything. This meant that runic spells and regular spells were different in some way or operated on different laws. How and why they were different he could only speculate. Also, these runic spells didn't seem to mind that he didn't have any elemental affinities. The fire orb spell activated just fine, even with his affinity for fire being at 0%. Which made sense, as the point of these scrolls was that anyone could activate them. It was a long way off, but he theorized that when he achieved the runesmith class, he could very well make himself equipment with various spell effects. The only problem with those was the high mana activating cost that skyrocketed their upkeep. Okay, I have decided. Roland nodded. He would practice making runic spells and increase his scribing skill for them. He would then scribe them down in a bundle of 10 for the auction. He was putting all of his eggs into one basket, but he believed that this was the best way if he didn't want to trap himself with that contract for 6 years. Thanks to his previous party members that had gifted him some golden coins, he would be okay even for half a year with no work. He would use this opportunity that they gave him well. With a new battle plan on his mind, he was reinvigorated. He just needed to power through this period and scribe like his life depended on it. Chapter 22, Auction. It was a normal day like any other at the Libra auction house. It was the latter part of it, and the workers were carrying some of the items into the back for appraisal. In this world, with a game-like system, it was easy to tell an object's true worth, though that was only if the person's identification skill was high enough, or if they had an enchanted item to help them out with it. Those items were costly, though, and they required mana as any other runic equipment. That is why a person with a high identification skill was sought after, as he could appraise many items throughout the day, without the need for mana. Percival was one of those people. He was the holder of a special non-combat analytic class that even had an appraisal skill included. His job was the identification of goods at this auction house. Not every item on the list made it to the showcase. There were rules put in place to not sell anything below a certain price. There was just not enough time for everything to be put out on stage. The Libra auction house was one of the largest ones in the city, and it had multiple stages where the items were being put up. They were all separated into ranks, so you wouldn't see a grand magic sword being auctioned before a lesser magic potion. Here, Mr. Percival, this is the last item from this batch. We still need to decide on the order of the items. A person brought in a certain item and placed it to the side at the entrance of Percival's office before leaving. There were already certain other products, all separated by prices and labeled by the man's assistant, waiting for pickup. The appraiser was a busy person, so not like he had enough time to do such things himself. The assistant was a regular human by the name of Cynthia. Another one into the trash bin, in it goes. The girl shouted out in a cheerful voice, while placing a metallic-looking statuette into a large tray with other various items. These were all products that were deemed unworthy for this auction house to sell them. Cynthia, how many times do I have to tell you to not be rough with those? If you break it, it will be deducted from your pay. Now bring me over that item, I want to go on my break. The man was a bit grumpy from all the long hours of appraising items and just wanted to be done with it. The girl slowly walked over to the item in question and picked it up. She was a bit confused as to what this was. It was rolled up with a couple of sheets of gray paper and tied together with string. I don't think this person is good at wrapping. She brought the item over to the grumpy old appraiser that looked at it with scorn. After he managed to get rid of the crude outer shell, he frowned even more. He had seen products like this before and knew that they weren't worth much. Even from the first glance, he could tell that the quality of the scroll parchment was the absolute lowest. Why would they make me appraise spell scrolls? They sell for almost nothing. Did this get through due to the packaging? I told them to look through the items before they bring them over here. What if there was a bundle of sticks in here? Percival the appraiser wanted to grasp the bundle of spell scrolls and toss them aside. Before he was able to do that, his lovely assistant grabbed one of them and took a look. Mr. Percival, these spell scrolls are strange. They only have a couple of large symbols on them. I thought you had to write a spell on these. The girl turned the spell scroll around to show it to the man, whose eyes bulged slightly. He looked down to see that these items weren't simple spell scrolls. No, they were all runic spell scrolls, which were much harder to make. "Give that back, you fool!" "Okay." Tilda the girl stuck her tongue out at the old man and went to the side. She was also waiting for him to finish up so she could take a break. The auction would be starting in a couple of hours, and she still had some other work to do. The appraiser fixed his glasses and placed one of the scrolls on the table so he could see it better. These are indeed runic spell scrolls. Which runesmith had enough time to make these? He was a bit baffled why anyone would make so many of these. Maybe a new runesmith was feeling bored so he or she made them. He didn't want to speculate more, so he leaned up and started examining the item. His identification and appraisal skills activated, and you could see a faint blue glow in the man's eyes for a fraction of the second. Runic fire arrow spell scroll common high. One of his eyebrows moved up after reading through the information. He thought this was some beginner runesmith's work, but it was actually of a high grade. Even accomplished smiths mostly made items at the intermediate level, while high was a sign of talent and hard work. A regular intermediate fire arrow spell went for 2 to 4 small silver coins, but this was a runic spell scroll. They worked a bit differently than the regular ones. The biggest difference was the possibility of amplifying the spell. The user had the option of adding more mana into the scroll, which would increase the output to a certain extent depending on the rank. Interesting. I'd say this scroll could even go for up to 9 small silver coins. Not bad for a common spell scroll. The man almost made a mistake by crumbling up these. If the owner got wind of it, he might have to even apologize in person. These scrolls even had a little logo drawn in the corner. It looked like a red shooting star or a comet. There were more of those scrolls there, so he got to it, going through them one by one. Highest. His eyebrow moved even higher as he saw that one of these scrolls was at the highest rating. This was something he didn't get to see often, an item with the highest rating. If the high-rated scroll could go for up to 9 small silver coins, then this one could even go for double, maybe even triple. The appraiser knew that a lot of the runesmiths were unwilling to sell spell scrolls below a certain price range. This was why they were placed in stores at exorbitant figures and never saw practical use. The highest graded spell scroll could actually go for quite the sum though. What did the highest rating mean? It meant that the spell was really close to jumping grades and going into a higher one. That would put this common spell scroll at half a step into the greater runic spell realm. By Solaria, who is this runesmith? Is he an advanced one? He mumbled to himself while finishing up with the appraisal. There were exactly 10 runic spell scrolls in this pile. 8 of them were at the high grade while 2 of them were at the highest. There wasn't even one that was at an intermediate level, which told him that the person that was making them was quite the master. The man racked his brain. He couldn't imagine this being one of the runesmiths from the city. Most of them were grizzled men with some lesser magical aptitude that barely managed to become a mana scribe. Most of them preferred working with metals and not scrolls. The only use for them was practicing their mana control. "Are you finished, Mr. Percival? It's getting late." The man looked up. He had spent a bit too long inspecting these items. He coughed into his hand and then started writing down the appropriate pricing. The pricing was mostly there as a guide for the auctioneer to start off. They would use it to choose the minimum bidding price of the item. Take them and be careful, they're delicate. Also wrap them up with some high-quality string for the auction. "Okay. Are we going to sell these as a bundle or separately?" the assistant asked while taking out some better-looking string and rolling up the sheets of monster skin. "Why are you asking me? I'm just the appraiser." They would probably sell better as a bundle. The highest graded scrolls might make the buyers bid further. He added his opinion while standing up. The scrolls that he just appraised were slightly unusual, but nothing really that extraordinary. There were items in this auction that the minimum bidding price was a gold coin. The scrolls that could fetch a couple of small or large silver coins apiece didn't really matter. The assistant girl shrugged while the old man walked out. She opened the door, and 2 more male workers walked in. They removed the tray of useless items from the room first. The other goods that were going to get auctioned out were spread out on larger tables by the prices. Some other people would come in and take a look at them. They needed to decide on the order of them appearing. This was something Cynthia was also partly responsible for. While this all was happening, Roland was standing outside the Libra auction house. He had handed over his workload that he had slaved on for months. He was wearing a robe and a face mask. His eyes looked bloodshot, as if he didn't sleep for a couple of days. He was reaching a boiling point. He had burned through most of his cash on crafting materials and could fill a couple of books with his low and lesser crafted runic spells now. He was quite pedantic when it came to his work ethic, unwilling to go to the auction house without at least a full clip with high-grade runic spells. He had worked tirelessly till this point. He looked at his status screen that went up a couple of levels since the last time. The skill that went up the most was his basic rune scribing skill. It was at level 5. Also, his rune mastery leveled up slightly while his understanding of making the runic scrolls continued. It was at level 2. It procured the runic fire arrow spell scroll from that shop. He still remembered the strange look the lady elf gave him after she brought it over. She even tried telling him that it wasn't worth it, and that he should just get one of the regular spell scrolls instead. He brought it back home, and created a perfect schematic. It even gave him double the experience compared to the lesser rune schematics he made. He was still filled with anticipation and vigor at that point. This soon turned to despair after he noticed that scribing a common runic spell was a lot harder than the lesser variant. He failed and failed, losing more money in the progress of going through his resources. He even had to go back and practice on the fire orb rune as it was more manageable. He needed to level his scribing skill up to even be able to create his first fire arrow spell at the lowest upgrade, and this was already a full month after he obtained this item for practice. 10 small gold coins that his party members had graciously given him started not to seem like such a big sum. He thought that it could even last him for 10 months, but he barely managed to last half a year while going through his crafting materials. He even had to dive into his adventure savings just to scrape by. At this point in time, he was sitting on his last small silver coin. If he didn't manage to make a profit with these scrolls, he would have to go find himself a job. He was very stubborn as he got it into his head that he needed good branding with his first auction. This was why he was unwilling to sell the lower-rated scrolls, and why he placed a small logo on the scroll, so that people would notice his brand. He also pretended to be a servant of some posh runesmith that made these runic spells. The disguise he was wearing was also part of his paranoia that had manifested itself slowly. It was partly due to the assassination attempt, and because he was worried that his father would find him and force him to go back. He had gotten a special plaque with a number. With this he could return later to get his money. Apparently his goods made it through the appraiser, as he saw some other sellers picking up their items that didn't make it through. I should go in and check. They told me that the sellers can sit in the back during the auction if they wanted. He was quite nervous as a student before a big exam, waiting for his turn to enter. He felt butterflies in his stomach, but he steeled his resolve and went in. He needed to see how the auction house operated, and how people reacted to his wares. He showed his plaque to the guard, and was allowed to enter without paying an entrance fee. On the inside, there were a couple of corridors leading to different auction stages. There was a separate one for the more valuable items, and you had to be someone of higher status to participate in those. The one his items were being auctioned off looked like a small theater stage. There were your usual seats in the front, but there were some in the balconies for the richer people that were willing to pay a bit more. He was slightly surprised that his items were being hosted here as he expected them to be in the other auction stage, for the lesser and common items. This one was the one used for common and grand ones. He could see people coming in and sitting in the front. The auction block where the auctioneer would be standing was still empty, but you could see the large curtain wiggling a bit, which indicated that there was something being done behind it. Bidders were getting paddles handed out to them with numbers. How things worked here was that the auctioneer would call the bids, and the bidders would then move those numbered paddles up if they wanted to raise it. The highest bidder then would win. The auctioneer would sometimes extend the bidding if he noticed someone being unsure. If no one continued bidding, it would end after a count of 3. The rest of the exchange would happen in the back, where the buyer would pay his coin to the auction house. The actual seller wouldn't really interact with the buyer in any way. They could even show up on another day to get their money. The auction house would bill him for the service. It was at 25% for now, as he was a first-timer. If he started selling more, he could get a better deal and even go down to 10%. Starting, he leaned back against the wall and looked at the stage that finally opened. To his surprise, instead of seeing some old no-nonsense man with a mustache, he saw a beautiful woman in a red dress. She was quite stacked in all the right places and was apparently the auctioneer. He figured that they were trying to appease the male carnal side with this lady. They were probably willing to spend more on the items with the beauty involved. This was one of the oldest tricks in the book. I would like to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to the Libra auction house. I will be your hostess for tonight. Tilda. She even struck a pose and made some kind of weird duck face that Roland recalled girls doing from his university days. The male audience looked happy. Their female counterparts weren't that excited though. Soon the first item appeared on display. It wasn't much, just an accessory with a lower graded enchantment. We start the bidding at 5 small silver. He could see some people raising up those number paddles, and the first auction ending in a few minutes. The experience wasn't very interesting, and the fact that he wasn't able to sleep well for the past few days was getting to him. After most of the common items were gone from the stage, Roland got concerned. Why weren't his scrolls showing up? He was sure that they should be among these common wares, but they were inching towards the greater ones by the looks of it. He was worried that he had entered the wrong auction stage, and that his items were getting sold in the other one. Now for the last of the common items of the night, we have something special. Just as he was about to ask someone about it, the lovely lady spoke out. We have a couple of runic fire arrow spell scrolls from an unknown master craftsman. What's so special about these runic spell scrolls, you might ask? Well, they are all mostly of the high grade. That's not all, dear customers. 2 of them are even of the highest grade. People started murmuring with each other, while Roland started getting nervous. His scrolls were out on display, and the auctioneer lady was making quite the spectacle of it. 2 workers brought out 2 wooden boxes and placed them on the stage area where the light shone. We have put them in a set of 5 in each box. There are 4 scrolls at the high grade and 1 at the highest grade. We will be starting the bid for the first box at 3 large silver coins. Roland quickly started adding things up in his head. At this price range he would be able to make a profit, and this was just the starting bid. The people started moving those paddles up. The moment Roland saw someone bid further, he felt his heart beating faster. He was finally seeing the fruit of his labor getting appreciated. It was like a large weight was lifted off his shoulders, and he could finally relax. The first box went for 4 large silver and 5 small silver, and the second one went for 4 large and 7 small. On his first attempt, he had managed to earn close to 1 small gold coin. Even if he deducted the auction house's pay cut, he would be able to recuperate his losses. Chapter 23. Earning Coins. Roland waited all the way until the end. He saw some finely crafted magical weapons and accessories be carried onto the stage that were sold for many gold coins. He was slightly envious, but he was just glad that he managed to sell his handcrafted wares. When he finally managed to get to his desired class, he thought that he would be able to produce even greater weapons. He was still tired. His sleep resistance skills have even leveled up once in the half-year he was stuck scribing in his tiny inn room. The people even started giving him strange looks as he only showed up for 1 meal before locking himself back in it. The auction went deep into the night and ended close to midnight. He stayed and waited. He wasn't willing to leave without getting his money. The auction house only let the sellers pick up their share after the auctions were over and not during them. There were times where the buyers changed their minds and refused to pay. They would be reported to the city guards then. The auction house was a sanctioned business and had ways of getting people to pay up. Roland made sure to keep his hood and mask on. The mask looked like one of those that ninjas wore. It only covered his mouth while leaving his eyes out in the open. The hood was covering the top of his head, so he didn't go for a full-face mask and deemed it unnecessary. He gave out a sigh when he was finally allowed to pick up his loot. There was a special room for this. After entering, he saw a clerk working there. It was an older man, and there were 2 guards standing beside him. There were also another 2 standing right beside the entrance. They were probably there to catch anyone that would think about grabbing more coins than they were entitled to. Seller number 64. You have earned a total of 9 large silver coins and 2 small silver coins. With a commission of 25%, you are left with 6 large silver coins and 9 small ones. The man did a fast recounting while Roland nodded. He lost 2 large silvers and 3 small ones due to the auction house's fee. He wasn't mad though, as he understood that it was worth it. He quickly took the money that was laid before him and neatly packed in a small satchel. He nodded without answering and then quickly left. Unbeknownst to him, some people in the auction house took note of him as they were curious who the new craftsman in the city was that was able to make the highest common grade spell scrolls. Roland ran all the way back to the inn with haste. There were still many people out and about in the city, drinking late into the night. He had grown a bit since half a year ago, and with the added bonuses of his running and sprinting skills, he was going fast. At the inn there weren't that many people around. Everyone was mostly in bed, as they needed to get things done in the morning. Back in his room, he collapsed on his straw mattress-filled bed. He couldn't really remember much past that as he woke up at 12 p.m. the next day, awoken to the church bells that sounded in the distance. He felt revitalized after the rest and ready to earn more cash. His plan was coming to fruition, and he had made the first step. Now he had to strike while the iron was hot. He needed more materials, and in due time better runic spells to practice on and then sell. Roland didn't know why, but it felt really good to manage on his own. He actually preferred working for himself, even though he was putting in more hours than a regular worker would. With the influx of new assets, he bought more resources, more ink, and more monster scrolls for the spells. He had ridden this fire arrow spell so many times that he was now a master of it. It would probably take him a while to master another comparable one, so he decided to focus on the fire arrow spell for now. He had spent countless hours redrawing it, affixing the magical pathways into the correct forms. He had even used up all of his sketching paper and pencils to practice while being low on mana. This fire arrow was certainly something designed for a runesmith class. It was very draining on his mana reserves. If he wasn't blessed with a large pool of mana, he wouldn't be able to scribe more than 1 or 2 of these runic spells per day. When a person was drained of their mana, they would start feeling dizzy and sleepy. If your mana ever hit 0, you would get a splitting headache and sometimes even pass out. This had happened to him one of the days he was scribing. His devotion to the task at hand had caused him to suffer a backlash. He even received a debuff to his mana regeneration the next day, which halted his progress even further. Time passed again and things were getting more interesting at the Libra auction house. Mr. Percival the appraiser had a stack of brand new runic scrolls, all of them with the runic version of the fire arrow spell. This time around there were 3 at the highest grade, which made the man wonder if this runesmith master was improving by the day. There were always high and highest graded runic scrolls there. Word around the city spread, and the magic shops were slowly beginning to look into this new person that was slowly nudging himself into their territory. But just as Roland had speculated, they didn't feel threatened just yet. The number of products going around was just too small to affect these large stores that had other items to sell than spell scrolls. He didn't know if they would act in any way, but for now, he was left alone to his devices. The more of the highest runes were added, the better the prices got. Roland was slowly regaining his lost fortune. He deposited 10 scrolls each every week while earning close to 1 small gold coin. Soon he was able to get a better quill, better paper, and was now even thinking of going to a more expensive inn that was further into the city. Things were looking quite good indeed, so good that he could now start thinking about the future once again and get back to his research. Another 3 months had passed in a flash. Roland was sitting in his tiny room with a complete stack of scrolls. 6 of them were at the highest grade while 4 of them were at the high one. I've gotten good at this one spell, but I think I need to move on from it. Roland was slightly tired of redrawing the same sequence over and over again. He felt like a person at the assembly line doing the exact same task every day. He needed some variation in his life, and he knew just the thing to spice things up. He placed his created scrolls into his spatial bag and decided to get dressed. He left the inn and headed out of the city, doing it on foot. He was sure to leave early in the morning, giving himself more time till nightfall. This city was built into a large mountain, but that didn't mean that rocks were the only thing in the area. There actually was a large forest nearby where he was headed. Within 2 hours he was at his destination. There should be some around here. There is one. Roland came to a stop and placed himself behind a tree. His stealth had leveled up from basic to the regular, but if he ever wanted to get it up to advanced, he would need a rogue class. He squatted down and reached into his storage bag. From it he pulled out a crude-looking book. The pages of this book were tied together by thin string and pushed through small holes at the edges. It was barely holding together from how bad it looked. On the other side was quite the familiar creature that Roland was inching closer towards. Jiggy, it was a goblin, but instead of being green, it was a lot paler. This was a variant that was called a mountain goblin. These creatures roamed the forest around the city, but they didn't venture towards it. They sometimes attacked carriages that went between cities, but that was a rare occurrence. Goblin didn't have much of a chance to react as a glowing red arrow shot right through its brain, melting it in the process. The person that produced this magical spell was Roland. He had his hand placed on the topmost page of his crude grimoire. He had made it from the lower and low-graded spell scrolls that he didn't want to sell. He had figured out one thing about his basic rune mastery skill. He could level it up by using either runic scrolls that he made or weapons that had runes engraved into them. These goblins didn't offer much in experience, but they were good enough for him to train his skills on them. The idea of using his stash of scrolls like a magic book just dawned on him once. The page that he used to activate his spell crumbled into dust soon after activation. This was the biggest weakness of this type of weapon. It had limited uses, but he could rapid fire with it without having to do any pesky incantations. Maybe if he faced that tier 2 fencer in battle again, he could actually do something about it by spamming these fire arrows his way. Even a tier 2 class would have a hard time evading so many tier 2 spells like the fire arrow spell. Roland took a glance at his stats and some of his skills that he was grinding. His most important ones were the ones concerning runes. He wasn't really using his mage class ones that much anymore. He even found these spell scrolls to be much more powerful than his regular spells. Name: Roland Arden. L35 classes. T1 Mage. L25 Secondary. T1 Runic Mana Scribe. L10 Main. P374 374 M. P1007 1751 448 448 Strength 26 Agility 30 Dexterity 52 Vitality 29 Endurance 28 Intelligence 90 Willpower 67 Charisma 13 Luck 6 Basic Mana Scribing L2 Skill allows scribing of basic spells to paper. Basic Rune Scribing L5 Skill allows scribing of runes to paper. Basic Rune Mastery L3 Passive Skill increases comprehension of runes and lowers MP requirement for using them by a small margin. He focused on grinding the rune scribing skill, which meant that his regular mana scribing fell behind. He didn't care for that though, as the runes were the way to go for him. His rune mastery skill was also going up now as he was finally using it as intended, for battle. Besides his index and willpower, the rest of his stats weren't really going up. He even attributed the points he got to him getting older. He noticed that the common runes started being manageable after he achieved the 4th level of his scribing skill. Before he got it, he could barely create the lowest graded one. The higher the level of this skill, the less mana he burned through while crafting. Thankfully he had a lot to spare even before that. Basic mana shaping L6 skill lets the mage shape mana into spells, gives bonuses to intelligence and willpower. The higher the skill, the better the user is at forming spells. Basic mana regulation L7 skill helps regulate the mana in the user's body. Increases mana regeneration by helping absorb ambient mana from the environment. The 2 skills he received from getting his mage class were also leveling up. He was constantly using his mana to shape the magic ink into the desired runic symbols. Luckily, this was enough for his mana shaping skill to level up along with the regulation skill that hastened his regeneration. He was able to regenerate all of his mana in a couple of hours. If he stayed really still and rested, it was even faster. Taking off his clothes also improved this task, as he had more uncovered skin to absorb the mana energy. He was a level 10 scribe after more than half a year of work. He was already at the level cap of his previous class within the same time. Leveling up his second, Tier 1 class was proving to be more challenging. He also didn't manage to scribe down that many rune schematics as he was without coin. This would be changing soon. He wanted to start buying out all the runic spell scrolls that he could find within the city. They were much cheaper than runic weapons, so he would focus on them first. He checked the time. He had a couple of hours for training, so he decided to go into the forest while using his old tactics. There were fewer trees for him to hide, and they were mostly of the spiky variety. He still could use them for cover while remaining still and using his stealth. He also didn't need to use those pesky incantations anymore. Using these spell scrolls in this makeshift spellbook was a lot faster. He was already dreaming about making a magical runic staff for himself. If he continued to gain levels with his rune mastery skill while gaining more mana, using runic weapons could be feasible in the foreseeable future. While daydreaming about runic weapons, he went deeper into the forest. It was the middle of the day, so he had plenty of time to let loose. The fire arrows rained down on the unsuspecting goblins that didn't have any time to react. He ended each encounter with a headshot, and he wouldn't be surprised if he got some title for it if he continued. He noticed that he wasn't getting that much experience points for these monsters, and he attributed this to him being a crafting class. He was doing this to level up his runic mastery that would give him some XP anyway, so it was a fine exchange. His hunt was brought to a halt after he heard a high-pitched sound. It was a familiar screech of a goblin. It was near his location, but still far enough away for him not to worry. These mountain goblin variants were a lot stronger than the green ones you'd find in the kingdom's warmer areas. They were slightly taller, and their hides were tougher, and it was over if they managed to surround you. It was considered a bad idea to fight them, unless you were at least in your second Tier 1 class, and in the latter parts of it. He wondered why the goblins were calling over their buddies. This was clearly a call for help, and soon a swarm of these little buggers would rush into the area. The smart thing would be to back away for now, but he was close to where the shout originated. Luck was on his side, as there was a small cliff in that direction. If the goblins decided to run towards him, they would need to climb up a steep ledge, which would give him enough time to escape, or even fire some magical spells at the climbing monsters. He remained at the ledge for the time being while trying to look to where the noises were coming from. He spotted someone coming his way, and it wasn't a goblin. This was someone he recognized from the inn he was staying at. It was a small girl, even shorter than him. This was the gnome girl that he bumped into the first day he came to town. She looked scared, and was running away. Behind her, 5 mountain goblins with some crude-looking clubs and short swords were chasing after her. She had a dagger in her hand, which looked used as it was drenched in goblin blood. What the girl was doing in the woods was a mystery. She clearly wasn't strong enough to fight off these mountain goblins alone, which made things even more strange. She was coming his way, but below him was a ledge of about 20 meters. She would need to climb up all the way here to get to safety, and he didn't think the goblins would let her. He could already imagine the girl going up while getting pelted with rocks, sticks, and maybe even the short swords. He gave out a sigh while looking at his grimoire of fire arrow spells. He had enough to spare. He also had the high ground advantage. It would probably be easy to take care of these monsters, and he did come here to use up these failed products. I guess it's time to save a fair maiden in need. Wonder if I can get some kind of white knight title for this, he thought to himself while taking aim, his hand on the makeshift spellbook. Chapter 24. Little Goblin Slayer to the Rescue. Helse, I had come to these woods to level up. She was someone you called a late bloomer. The gnome girl was already past 16 years in her life, but she had just recently achieved her ascension class. The girl looked similar to a gnome, but she wasn't of pure descent. Her height was above what a normal gnome reached at 140 centimeters. Her figure was also quite voluptuous in regard to other gnome girls, but she mostly hid it well under baggy clothes or armor like today. She had fine features compared to others of her kind that mostly had rounder heads with larger eyes. Her hair was long and orange, and she had put it in a ponytail so that it wouldn't get in the way of her first hunt. She was an orphan. The whereabouts of her family were unknown as she was abandoned at a young age. She was left at one of the orphanages run by the Church of Solaria and spent most of her life there. She would do chores there, slowly learning how to cook, clean, and various other tasks. Even though the church was the ones producing the class change crystals, they wouldn't just give it to the orphans. The child had to decide if they wanted to live as an acolyte or abandon the church life by the age of 14. She had chosen to leave, getting a job at a few places throughout Edelgard, and finally ending up at the inn where she was now employed. She had worked for 2 years saving up for herself, and finally managed to get herself one of those elusive stones. She went through her ascension. The class that she was rewarded was a scout that boasted high agility and detection skills. This might have not been her chosen profession, but she was happy nevertheless. There was a slight problem though. The city she lived in had no nearby dungeon with easy monsters to practice on. She was able to register at the Adventurers Guild, but there was not much work for Tier 1 scouts that were still at the first level and had no battle experience. The notice board for bronze adventurers was filled with tasks similar to her current job. This was something she was trying to abandon as she was fed up with that sort of lifestyle. She was someone that was stubborn. She didn't want to ask for help from other adventurers. She also couldn't trust them, mostly the male adventurers that could try to take advantage of her. She finally decided to go into the nearby forest. The walk there took her 2 hours. She had spent the rest of her savings on a dagger and on cheap leather armor. This armor consisted of a chest piece and some wrist guards. The rest of her attire was simple cloth. She had never hunted a monster before in her life, but from what she heard the goblins were quite easy to slay. To her knowledge, they weren't stronger than 10-year-old human children, which was giving her quite the confidence boost. Helse, I wandered into the forest with the dagger in hand, going deeper and deeper without looking back. She was dead set on leveling up and starting her new life as an adventurer. The wind howled and the trees started rustling about, which caused her to be vigilant. Her class was a scout that gave her better vision than others. This class was also adept at hiding their presence while feeling out the area. Soon enough she spotted her first target. It was a pale-looking goblin with a large wooden club in its hand. She was a gnome hybrid, so her size was slightly larger than this small monster. This placed her at an advantage as she had the height advantage. After observing the monster for a moment, she noticed that it was quite lean and muscular. This didn't halt her advance. She was dead set on hunting this goblin. She gripped her dagger and started sneaking forward. She knew that the element of surprise was paramount. If she managed to land a backstab, she could probably deliver a killing blow. She moved forward while the monster was looking down at something. There were some large insects there that the goblin started stomping on. This gave her a chance to move forward while sneaking. The goblin was unaware of the small person sneaking up behind it. It switched to hitting the ground with its club while grinning. Suddenly it heard something snap behind it, which put it on alert. The goblin turned around with haste to see a pointy-eared girl with a dagger rushing its way. It didn't have that much time to react, and it wasn't very skilled either. The goblin just swung its wooden weapon randomly in hopes of protecting itself. This was partially successful as it managed to deliver a blow to Helsai's side. This caused her dagger to go off target and plunge itself into the monster's shoulder instead of its neck. The monster screamed out loud, the pain unbearable as it jumped back to get away. The small gnome girl panted hard. She needed some time to catch her breath as the wooden club had slammed into her side, causing some damage. The small goblin was a lot stronger than anticipated. Even though her armor held, she almost had her ribs broken. She didn't realize that the monster had called for its friends, so she continued. The enemy was wounded, and she just needed to finish it off. The goblin, with rage in its eyes, charged forward. It went into a berserk state and started swinging wide. The girl was slippery as an eel. The blows weren't reaching her, but she couldn't move forward either. The first blow had taken the wind out of her, and she was now hesitating. She had almost no combat experience, having only occasionally fought with the other orphans or drunkards in the city. Soon enough more goblins started appearing, which finally forced her to turn around and run. She could barely handle one of these monsters. What could she do when 4 more appeared? So started her getaway. She was panting while running towards the city. The forest was unknown to her, and she was still just a level 1 scout. Her tracking skills weren't quite there, so she found herself running in a random direction. This was a mountainous area, and luck wasn't on her side, as she found herself blocked by a high rocky wall. She looked to the sides as the road forward was blocked. She could hear the angry goblins running behind her, which caused her to panic, unable to decide. Should she try climbing this or try her luck by going sideways? There could be a better climbing spot further down. Before she could decide, one of the goblins jumped out at her. It didn't get far though, as something bright and red came whizzing from somewhere. It pierced the monster's head and stopped it in its tracks. 1 monster was dead, and 4 more remained. "Hey, you alive down there?" She heard a voice from above, and she found it slightly familiar. She looked up and saw a person standing there. This person was wearing a black robe, and it was hard to make out his clothes. By the sound of the voice, she knew that it was someone younger, but still a man. I'm fine, but there are more coming," she shouted out, while slightly relieved that there was another person here that was even willing to help. "I know, wait a moment, I'll clear them out." This was what the person said before the massacre began. She could see more of those red flaming arrows being shot out. They made beautiful red arches, and burrowed themselves into the goblins the moment they jumped out from the bushes. 5 spells and 5 goblins were dead. She looked at the charred corpses that were missing their heads. The smell was something that she wouldn't forget for quite some time. She spaced out for a moment before that person's voice brought her back to reality. "Why are you standing there? You need to leave. More goblins will be coming soon." "Oh, you should probably get the mana stone from that goblin there. The second one on the left before that, it's to the right of its heart," the person shouted while dropping down some rope. Helse, I looked at the goblin in question and decided to follow the advice. To her surprise, a small mana stone was there. If she could sell it, she could probably earn a few small silvers. She didn't remain there for much longer. The girl was already scared as it was. She started climbing to get to safety. The ledge wasn't that steep, so she managed to do it in a couple of minutes. On top, she collapsed onto her knees while panting. Strength left her body due to having to run in a panic this far. "You okay there? Helse, right?" She turned her head to the person that rescued her. This was apparently someone that knew her, but she was unsure from where. What she saw was a young human male about 160 cm in height pulling the rope up and placing it into a bag of holding. The wind moved his hood around, and she could finally make out his face. This was indeed someone that she knew, someone that lived at the inn that she worked at. Most people thought he was a weirdo. He always stayed locked in his room, and would only leave to eat, and rarely went outside. The innkeeper told her to not bother him, as he could be some kind of a cult member. He was always seen in a black robe covering his face, and never talked to anyone or made any friends. He fired off some spells, so he might have a magic class. A ritualist or a warlock was a person that made a pact with a demon or monster of some sort, so she was slightly concerned. Yes, I'm fine." She stood up. Her dagger was strapped to her side. She backed off a little bit as she was unsure about this person's motives. You didn't see many people helping others for no reason. This person was also someone she didn't know that well. This made her reserved. Keeping a distance was probably the correct thing to do now. "See, there are already some new ones coming." The human in the robe pointed into the distance from where she came. More goblins started to appear, probably there to avenge their slain friends that were butchered. "We should leave. If an evolved variant appears, it won't be this easy," the youth said while turning his back to her. She was still a bit on the fence about following this unknown person. He was still someone from the city, though, and the rumors were probably exaggerated. Behind her, she could hear the maddened shouts of the monsters that had found their murdered friends. It was time to get out of there. Wait for me, I'm coming." She ran after the human boy that was quite fast on his feet. She was someone that was adept at running, but even then she couldn't catch up to him. It didn't take long for them to reach the paved road that led into the city. The goblins would probably not chase them any further than this, so she felt relieved. She leaned over while panting, her hands to her knees. She made it out alive in one piece. She didn't expect these monsters to be as crafty. Even when she managed to stab the creature in the shoulder, it didn't do much damage. This was a total failure on her part, and she knew it. After resting a bit, she looked up. The human boy was staring at her. She felt weird. This person had helped her, but she had a hard time expressing her gratitude. Before she could open her mouth, he spoke out first. "What were you thinking? Have you never fought a goblin before? What level are you? If I wasn't close by, you would have been getting eaten at this moment. And another thing." The human youth had removed his hood and started berating her. He crossed his arms over one another and started listing the things that she had done wrong. He even started questioning her choice of equipment. She felt like she was being scolded by one of the older nuns from back in the church days. This boy looked younger than her, which made the whole thing even more degrading. "If you weren't close by, I had everything under control." She puffed up her cheeks along with her chest, her long eyebrows angling inwards. She was mad. Her plan of being an adventurer didn't work out as intended, and now she was getting lectured by some snotty kid. He might have been some kind of magician, but he was still a child in her eyes. "That's right, I was just luring them into a trap, you idiot. Then you appeared and ruined my plan. Who needed your help? I was fine on my own." She moved her head to the side while harumping loudly. The youth that was reprimanding her stopped talking, while astonishment covered his face. He watched as Helse. I stubbornly turned her head to the side while biting her lower lip. While trying to act tough and not facing the person that rescued her, she started walking. She could slightly see the youth's face contorting into odd shapes. He was probably baffled by her reaction, which made her feel bad. She was never good at apologizing for her wrongdoings, and even worse at thanking people that had helped her. The two didn't talk much after her outburst. They kept a distance of a few meters from each other. The gnome girl wanted to apologize, but each time she saw the youth's face, she felt indignation, as if he was looking down on her for failing. They finally separated at the city entrance and both went their own way. There was a tiny problem though. Helse, I had forgotten that the youth that she didn't know the name of was staying at the inn she was working at. She was also a worker that lived there, so they almost immediately bumped back into each other. She kept her distance as he was eating his supper. Both had spent most of their day walking back and forth and adventuring in the forest, so it was already close to 7. The world here also had a 24-hour day cycle, but there were 13 months on the calendar instead of 12. Hells, I felt a bit bad about not having thanked him yet. She made a fist with her hand and brought it to her chest while clutching it. She had made a decision. She grabbed one of the better-looking sausages from the pantry. Her plan unfolded as she used the busy hours to sneak over to the robed stranger. She placed the nicely prepared meat sausage along with a plate on his table, her mouth moving fast as she talked. "Here, I found this just lying there, thought you might want one." The youth looked at the item presented to him with a raised eyebrow, then back to the smaller half-gnome girl that was presenting it to him. Another bout of uncomfortable silence unfolded which caused the girl to have another outburst. "Just take it already. What are you taking so long? Not like I brought it over to thank you for helping me or anything. Idiot." She slammed the table with both her hands which made the whole thing shake. She then stormed off back into the kitchen. Some of the patrons noticed the exchange and even gave the half-gnome a whistle. Roland, who was still looking at the sausage that was given to him, seemingly free of charge, was quite surprised. He didn't think these types of people existed in real life. He grabbed the sausage and gave it a taste. He couldn't just waste good food. In the back of his mind, he was slightly amused by the way the girl acted. It was quite similar to how some popular characters in various works of fiction conducted themselves. He could even see her trying to sneak a peek from the corner, probably wanting to see if he was eating the gift that she prepared. He also needed to talk to the girl later. She was obviously unfit to wander into those dangerous woods. As an adult, it was hard to not worry about someone that acted this much as a little brat. He would later try talking to her again, but after she had cooled off, as it seemed that she was still slightly irritated. But this would have to wait for now, as he had a really big sausage to devour now. Chapter 25. Making a Deal. Roland was back in his room. The day had been a strange one. He went out to test his spell scroll-slinging abilities on some goblins. But what he found, there was a young girl almost getting herself killed. He didn't want to pry too much into her business, and she didn't react kindly when he started reprimanding her. The other peculiar thing was how she acted. The whole encounter made him think that he was stuck in some kind of game world, as he didn't think people like that existed. She had multiple emotional outbursts towards him, while on the other hand acted all grateful and even shy while bringing over some food. Well, she might just be bipolar. Should I stay clear of her? He thought, but maybe he was reading too much into her character traits there. There were all sorts of people in this world. He had managed to get a free sausage as a reward, so it was worth it. He was now stuffed and back in his room. He would scribe one more fire arrow spell before going to bed. Tomorrow would be the day when he would finally go on a spending spree. He needed to buy out as many runic spell scrolls as possible. He could then start creating schematics for them to quickly gain levels. The more levels and the better stats he achieved, the faster he would become at creating his wares. He was also hopeful that in the future the Libra auction house would drop their percentages. Losing 25% after they got their cut was a bit much. He wasn't sure if the regular stores charged others as much for their wares. He used his usual disguise that made him look like a little warlock in training. The place he was visiting first was the same one he got the runic fire arrow spell from. It was the store that was called Exior's Magic Emporium. He stepped forward. The doors opened by themselves with the help of some kind of enchantment. He wanted to examine this door. Maybe it also operated on some runes, and he would be able to add another one to his collection. There weren't that many people in here, and he didn't really come here often. The general store that was closer to his inn had all the necessary items. He was also concerned that if he came here too often, his disguise as the person selling the runic scrolls would fall through. The elven girl by the name Ziliana was still here acting as the main salesperson. He just moved over to the display case with the runic spells. They were all still there. Even though there weren't many, he could use them for research. They looked dusty as before, and even though he was able to make some profit on them, the other crafters didn't seem to be able to. He had a bit of an advantage over other people. He could just take their work and improve upon it. Even if the person made the lowest of low runic spells, he could turn it into the highest one in a matter of hours. Common grade runic spells were a bit harder to correct. They used a lot more runes, and even their schematics were double their size. This was also why he needed more time to scribe them down, and why it took him half a year to get the crafting process down to near perfection. This was also just for one rune. If he tried completing a totally new one, it could take him just as long. He looked to the elf lady, motioning her over as he wanted to buy a couple of these scrolls. She smiled at him and went over. He wasn't sure if she was doing it on purpose, but her hips were swinging side to side in an alluring way. The high heels she was wearing were making clicking sounds against the wooden floor panels when she moved forward. "What will it be, dear customer? I see that you have decided, Tilda. I'd like to buy this runic orb of light spell scroll, and this runic aqua ball spell scroll, also this frostbolt one." He started listing them off. He wasn't sure if he had enough money for all of them. They would be great for his future research, as he was itching to start fiddling with the runic components. He had already listed down all the parts into his notes, and now he just needed some time to experiment. "You want to buy the runic spell scrolls?" Wait a moment, I'll be right back," the elf replied and walked away. This was an unexpected reaction. He started wondering if there was something wrong. Normally, they would just hand over the goods, take the coins, and it would be over. Maybe she had more scrolls in the back, and she didn't want to move these dusty ones? He remained in the store and waited. He even saw the elf go up the stairs, the same ones that he had used before. Are the scrolls stored up there? He wasn't sure what this was about, but he just waited. He needed these spell scrolls, as without them he wouldn't be able to progress. He needed more samples to work with. The number of rune schematics he possessed wasn't that high, and only one was good for earning money. After about 5 minutes, the elf finally descended from the stairs and started walking back towards him. She wasn't carrying any scrolls with her, so Roland's first assumption was wrong. "Excuse me, I've made you wait." "It's fine, can I get these scrolls then?" he asked, as he didn't want to waste any more time here. He still wanted to see if he could get some better materials for his work. "I have to apologize, but that won't be possible." "Excuse me?" He was baffled by the answer. Was there something wrong with him buying these? Did someone figure out his scheme, and that he could make schematics of already completed runic symbols? His mind spun into conspiracy theory territory as he started sweating. "Ah, don't worry, it's not like that. The manager would just like to speak with you." "The manager?" The image of a gnome working with some large pictures popped into his head. "Yes, he wishes to discuss some business opportunities. I'm sure he will allow the purchase of these scrolls after that. Business opportunities?" The elf girl just smiled without explaining herself. Roland tried deducting the answer in his mind, and the only thing coming to mind was that he was found out. They didn't want to sell him the runic spells, and they wanted to talk business. If this wasn't about him going to the auction house, then he would eat his shoe. He had 2 options: leaving and trying another shop. This wasn't the only one with these unused runic spells. The other one was to head up and see what this person wanted from him. If he just left, then he would be left uninformed about this manager's motives. Roland had decided to go and see him. He didn't think that he was in any danger, as this man wasn't a warrior, but an alchemist. He was also a store owner, so he probably did just want to throw a business proposition his way. He could always decline and move on with his life. Leaving the city if things got complicated was also an option. "Okay, lead the way." He nodded while the golden-haired elf smiled. He was soon before the same door as half a year ago. Not much had changed there. The person inside still looked the same. The alchemist equipment might have increased with a few pitchers and beakers here and there, though. The door closed behind him after the elf woman had left. He was now left alone with the store's manager. If he was also the owner of it was unknown to him. He remained standing and looked around. Besides the alchemist utensils, there was also a furnace to the side. He wondered why something like that was here, right next to a bunch of chemicals and flammable books that were standing on a nearby bookshelf. Then he remembered that this world probably didn't have anyone to check the safety measures of stores. "Runic fire arrows, eh?" "Huh?" He could hear the gnome finally speak up. He had a higher pitched voice than a human, and was a lot shorter. Roland compared the man's height to the other gnomes he had seen around the city, and he was a bit on the taller side, close to 120 cm. "What about runic fire arrows?" he replied, playing dumb as he didn't know if he had been really found out or just being tested. The older man stopped doing what he was and finally stepped out from behind the alchemist setup he was working on. He had a grumpy expression on his face. Roland could finally get a good look at him. The man had a full beard that was gray, and was wearing some kind of turban on top of his head. His ears were pointy and long, not as long as an elf's though. He had quite a large nose with a large wart on the left nostril. His clothes consisted of a baggy robe that was tied to him with a brown leather belt. "Kid, don't insult my intelligence. Did you really think no one would notice your antics? I've got to give it to you. You have a lot of talent if you can produce spells of that quality, and all at such a young age." He moved forward while talking, heading over to another desk that was in the corner. It had a large chair behind it, probably so that he could see over it, as it looked to be human-sized. He sat himself down, and then took out a wooden pipe. Smoke soon flowed out from his nostrils. Roland was a bit worried that he was exposed. He had disguised himself and even said that he was working for someone else when he was selling his wares. Maybe if he played dumb he could still evade suspicion. "I was just hired to deliver the scrolls there." The gnome just raised his eyebrow as if he was looking at an idiot. He scuffed some while blowing out some smoke Roland's way. "You sure are persistent with your little story. If you wanted to hide you shouldn't have stuck out like a vampire in the sun. Listen here, your secret is out. I could give a mole rat's ass about the reason you were using that stupid disguise. I am here to talk about money." Roland just remained in place and continued to listen. At this point, he already figured that there was no way of talking himself out of this. This gnome person probably had informants at the auction house that tipped him off. He could have even been followed by someone that was good at hiding. He as a mage class was not really good at detecting trouble, so people could easily sneak upon him. "You've got talent, kid, but even more important than that is that class and work ethic. That class? The gnome smiled at him while removing the pipe from his mouth as he explained further. You are still green, kid. Do you think you can hide your special class from anyone without an enchantment to block out the identification skill? The gnome's eyes shone blue for a split second as he looked at Roland. Level 10 already. Not bad. You have a bright future ahead of you if you continue working hard. Roland took a step back while digesting this information. This person had a high identification skill, and he could read him as an open book. His runic mana scribe class had been revealed to him, and he couldn't even do anything about it. You saw my class back then? That's right, I have a very good memory. You know us intelligence types. Then someone started selling runic spell scrolls. Now why would any respectable runesmith sell crummy spell scrolls? Maybe it was a runic mana scribe instead, him? The way this man had figured him out was revealed. It was all mostly thanks to one skill. All of the work that went into his disguise had been for nothing, as he was exposed right from the beginning. What the old man wanted from him was still up to debate. That's just, he slumped a bit forward in defeat. His thought he had it all figured out, but apparently he was just deluding himself. Now, I'm not here to blackmail you or anything, so just relax and take a seat. We have a lot to talk about. Roland just sat down in defeat. There was no reason to deny it anymore. What do you want? Not much. I want you to work with me. I'm not signing one of those ludicrous contracts. Roland was quick to reply. He still wasn't willing to get himself stuck working for 6 years in one spot. He would rather leave the city and try elsewhere. He had made enough to relocate. Those contracts are for talentless hacks. You kid have a future. This is how I see it. I'll supply you with the location where you can develop your craft. I'll even lower the price for the materials. The man started talking business. He wanted to sponsor Roland. He would give him his own place where he could do his rune crafting. The contract he was offering was a lot less strenuous than the one he saw half a year ago. He wouldn't need to share any of his secrets. He would only be required to continue crafting like he already did. This store would take care of the selling part. Their commission was also lower than of the auction house at 15%. This contract looks a bit one-sided. Why are you willing to give me so much freedom? It looked a bit fishy. The only binding thing here was that he could only sell his wares to this store. He could freely craft for himself and give them away for free if he wanted. There was even a clause that he was allowed to sell it at a cheaper price for a couple of people of his choosing, and he could also negotiate for it. The period of this contract was also shorter, just 3 years, after which he was up for renegotiating or just leaving outright. That's an easy answer. You show a lot of promise. There aren't many people at your age that have such a high level. You probably don't realize how rare unique classes like yours are. I am willing to invest in your talent. I don't think that it's a bad deal. The man smiled while already having the contract ready. Roland only needed to sign on the dotted line, and it would be finalized. The punishment for breaking the contract was a slightly lesser curse that would only remove his mana by 30%. It also didn't take into effect instantly if he broke one rule, and he could work it out with the boss to evade it. It was actually a good contract for someone with no backing and no influence like him, who could work and sell his items while not having to worry about the price margin. The auction house buyers were sometimes stingy with their purchases. He would also get his own place to tinker about, probably one of the rooms in this large building. This contract could even extend to when he advanced to a blacksmith. It was easy to scribe spell scrolls, but he would need a fully equipped smithy to get anything done as a blacksmith. The contract stated that the company he was signing with was required to present him with facilities for his craft. It wasn't limited to his runic mana scribe profession either. I see that you have made your research. It would probably be unwise for me to refuse, he replied while looking at the old man that was wiggling the contract before him. The gnome also warned him about the other stores. Apparently not everyone was as lenient as he was. Others might want to crush him instead of recruiting. It would be easy to pull some strings and have him banned from the auction houses in Edelgard. In this city, there existed something like a council. Their members were the most influential businessmen in the city, merchants, store owners, owners of large smithing shops, and other various businesses. They gathered every 3 months for discussions. If an upstart appeared, they would first try to get them over to their side. If they resisted, they would be crushed. Roland was flying under the radar for now, but as soon as he tried creating his own company, the council would come on knocking. The gnome here was part of it, so he could put him under his protective umbrella and shield him from any future woes. Roland moved his head down and thought. The deal wasn't that bad, and he was still young. The contract was only 3 years, so he would have a lot of leeway when he improved later on. He also didn't know how long he would have to keep this up until he would actually have enough money to buy his own workshop. Let me think about it. Could I get a copy of this contract and read it over? The old gnome didn't have a reason to refuse, and Roland left. He would read through the contract again and come up with a few modifications, like being allowed to keep his own brand symbol of the small red comet along with having his identity hidden. In the end, he would agree to it. His life of crafting had only begun with this step. Chapter 26. Examining Scrolls. Sign here on the dotted line. Is my name enough? Yeah, that's fine. The contract mostly just reacts to your mana and not your actual name. Roland wrote his name into the contract that went through some changes. He managed to get the gnome to agree to keep his true identity a secret. He also didn't mention that he was from a noble house. The most important clause, though, was the one stating that the gnome couldn't undersell his work. There was a minimal price negotiated, while taking into account what the scrolls were selling in the auction. Any other items he created would be negotiated further, but he didn't feel like the gnome was trying to rip him off, at least not too much. He still wanted to make a profit. He wouldn't be surprised if they knew that how far the gnome's identification skill was able to peak was unknown. He himself could only use it on certain items, and he would mostly just get the general name. He couldn't analyze people well either. If he looked at Ziliana, the only info he got was that she was a sun elf. This was the default elven race around here. Besides sun elves, there were also moon elves that were similar looking to dark elves from most stories. For one reason or another, these two races didn't get along with each other. The woman rolled up the contract after it was finalized. He had finally accepted the offer, and his life as a contract worker had begun. Luckily, he didn't really have to make that many scrolls, and should be able to do his research as well. He was even going to receive a personal assistant if he did well. He was led down into the basement. He didn't occupy any of the rooms closer to the manager's room. The place he received was a bit dim, and had a very dungeon-like vibe to it. He had gone through some dungeon training against goblins, so he was fine with places like this. We weren't really using this one. That's why it's a bit dirty, Ileana said while opening the door and showing Roland in. There wasn't much inside this room. Some empty boxes in the corner along with a wooden table and some chairs. The cleaning lady would come soon, and some furniture would be carried over as well. Here's the key, don't lose it. He was handed the key. He would be able to come to this place whenever he wanted, and even work through the nights. The gnome manager knew that some craftsmen liked to work hard. A bed would be supplied for him. Roland was thinking about moving from the inn here. He didn't need to pay for rent, but the air was kind of stale. You can start working tomorrow. Welcome to Xior's Magic Emporium staff. Tilda, you can call me Big Sis from now on. The elf struck a pose by placing her hands to her hips while looking at Roland. He just looked back with narrowed eyes while replying. All right. He almost forgot that he was an 11-year-old kid, which had its pros and cons. Roland also asked if the manager was the owner of the store, and if the store was named after him. It was revealed that he was only someone akin to a regional manager of a larger company. It had a lot of chain stores strung throughout the city, and the main one was in the capital city. When he asked the elf about the gnome's full name, she just smiled at him without revealing it. Roland was getting the facilities and the basic materials. He wouldn't be getting the research materials though, that was on him. He returned to the first floor, and bought out every single runic spell that he could. With the contract in place, he felt like he could invest in his future more. He didn't inform his new boss about his unique skill. Even if the gnome saw his status screen, the name debugger probably didn't ring a bell. He got some new spells that did various things. The Orb of Light spell felt similar to his Fire Orb spell, as it just produced a light of a different color. He made sure to find spells that worked similarly. So if he already figured out how to produce the Fire Arrow spell, he wanted to get his hands on a Water Arrow spell or an Earth Arrow spell. He could then compare the schematics and see if the parts or runes were similar. This store had a limited variety of these spells. This forced him to search them elsewhere. Luckily, the manager had supplied him with an armband that would hide his status. He would seem like an ordinary mana scribe to everyone else. After a day of searching, he had managed to find a couple of elemental variations of the Mana Bolt spell and the Mana Arrow spells. Surprisingly, there were none of the basic lesser runes of those two spells. Probably the runesmiths creating these deemed those two spells below them. He returned to the inn after a full day of running around town. The energetic half-gnome girl was running around the inn again. He was glad that she was still alive. He was slightly worried that she might have wandered into the woods again. He hoped that she had learned her lesson, but he didn't really have the time to be her nanny. She had to make her own decisions. The next day Roland returned to the store. His office was now filled with some boxes that had blank scrolls in them. There were a couple of higher quality inkwells that were supplied and some sketching paper as well. He brought some of his own crafting utensils from the inn, as he was already used to the quill he was using. He closed the door behind him and walked around the place before taking a seat at his new desk. Well, time to get to work. This was still his job, so he decided to perform his main task of scribing by recreating his staple runic Fire Arrow spell. He was able to scribe it down within an hour, and had enough mana left to make another one. Contract stated that he was to make a minimum of 10 common grade spell scrolls a week. He was of course allowed to make more of them, and would get a bonus accordingly. Roland wasn't only interested in the money though, he wanted to progress, increase his levels, and also to find out how these runes operated. The problem was that to progress he needed money and lots of it. He managed to get a temporary sponsor, but it was on him if he proved himself as a sound investment. He brought out a scroll that he had bought It had the runic frost arrow spell on it. He also had a runic gale arrow scroll. He took out a pencil and some paper and activated his debugging skill. You have created the schematic for the common frost arrow rune highest. You have created the schematic for the common gale arrow rune highest. He received 2000 XP for each schematic. He had also tried making schematics of lower grades to see if he could stack more experience. He made an intermediate one of a common rune for 1000 XP. When he went for the perfected one, he was rewarded with another 1000. The trick didn't work. There was some kind of cap on gaining experience for making schematics. He had spent his first working days scribing the minimal number of runic scrolls while using the rest of his time on creating schematics of the various runic spells that he got from the other stores. They were mostly of the common grade, which caused him to level up faster. He wanted to stick all of the made schematics to a wooden notice board so that he could look at them while doing his research. He abandoned this notion as he didn't want to leave a board with multiple highest graded rune schematics out in the open. This would give away his secrets right from the get-go. He was sure to include a clause in the contract that there wouldn't be any spying devices or people watching over his room. Still, he didn't know if those contracts were 100% safe, so he would keep those schematics in his storage bag for now. When he needed to do some research, he would just take them out. He was doing this now. He placed all of the elemental arrow spells that he had gathered. The schematic that he was the most familiar with was in the middle while the two others were to the sides. He could instantly see that some of the larger runic symbols were the same. That's probably the component responsible for the whole arrow part of the spell. He glanced at the other two spells. Besides the middle rune that was identical in all the other spells, there were 4 other symbols. Each of these runes was composed of smaller parts, and they all connected with each other to form a complete spell schematic. He just needed to figure it out. This was easier said than done. I wonder what will happen if I rearrange some of these components. He had all the correct pathways on the schematics. What would happen if he replaced one of the fire arrow runic symbols with one from the gale arrows? Could he produce a new spell? Would it blow up? He had multiple attacking spells to work with. He could exchange the components with each other, as if he was playing with Legos. Well, there is only one way to find out. He began his first test, combining the gale arrow with the fire arrow. The spells weren't that different. They both produced elemental arrows. The gale arrow was a lot faster than the fire arrow, but it lacked the added fire damage that the other spell had. Firstly, he drew a schematic, while replacing the last runic symbol from the fire arrow spell with the one from the gale arrow. He only needed to place the pathways in the correct order, and to make it a closed monocircuit to finish the deal. He instantly moved his head closer to examine his creation. The most glaring thing he saw was the mass of red after he connected the largest runic component at the end. His debugging skill was telling him that it wouldn't work. He didn't get a prompt that he had created a new spell either. He wasn't deterred. He started dissecting all of these spells into parts, and his research continued. Thanks to his debugging skill, he was saving a lot of time. He could only imagine how many blank scrolls and magic ink he would have to burn through if he did all of this manually. You have created the schematic for the lesser smoke arrow rune lowest in the end. A combination pattern that worked was made. He created a lesser runic spell by combining higher grade runes with each other. He theorized that combining 2 elements with each other wasn't such an easy thing. This might have been tier 3 territory, as he was hoping for something like a frostfire arrow, but got a glorified smokescreen instead. There were a lot of problems with this particular rune. After combining 2 perfect schematics, he was left with a barely working one. His debugging skill showed him red lines everywhere, and even some of the components needed replacing. He had somehow managed to graph these 2 spells together. He shoved quite a bit of parts together while hoping for the best. His experiment showed results, but the spell he created was less than stellar. This isn't going too well. He could spend months and years doing it like this. The debugging skill was aiding him, but he was only randomly combining the runes with each other. This could allow him to get some new spells, but he wouldn't really understand how. Also, the whole process was too random and time-consuming. His main goal was to figure out the way these runes worked. He already knew that they were similar to circuits and programs. They followed some kind of binary language, and maybe there were even parts that had complex algorithms working in them that were responsible for the spell's shape or power output. He managed to produce this spell within a week after randomly combining the larger runes with each other. The detail in drawing these schematics also played a big role in everything. If he missed one important section the debugging skill didn't activate, he then had to go through the entire thing to find the part he missed. Roland finally decided to perform some live tests. He took the lesser runes as the base for his next experiment. It was the fire orb rune and the light orb spell that were quite similar. Both produced a sphere of light that varied in brightness and the element used. He had isolated some elements that he thought were responsible. He got to work, but he wasn't aiming to create proper schematics. No, he wanted to use the supplied scrolls for his research. The way the runes started was all the same. They always had the same element there that was responsible for absorbing mana from a user. It varied in size, being larger in the common grade runic spells. A craftsman needed to close the whole circuit onto this element. You also had to fashion additional magical pathways around all the runic symbols that weren't visible to the naked eye. These pathways were a bit thicker than the rest, and their purpose was to siphon mana into the starting component. It was more or less akin to a power input or power plug. While the person inserting mana was seen as a big battery, the mana would be gathered through all of the pathways and focused through this power input. The other traces would then carry the mana into the other rune parts. Sometimes it was quite linear, while other times the mana was distributed to multiple of them at once. Just like in series and parallel circuits, the way the mana flowed changed depending on which circuit type was being used. He also made a distinction between the mana flow and the mana pressure in the whole circuit. This pressure was akin to voltage in a battery. It would push the mana energy into the traces and be responsible on how large the flow was. In a series circuit type, this mana voltage would be split between its components equally, and it also would cease to work if one of the parts was hindered in any way. In a parallel circuit, it wouldn't lose this pressure, but it would use up mana faster. This was some of the basics. Now he continued as he needed to figure out the rest of it. I think this one might be something similar to a resistor. He glanced at both the spell diagrams of the orb spells. He focused on something that he believed looked like a resistor. The fire orb one was smaller in size than from the regular orb of light. His first test would be to replace the two with each other to see if the orb of light spell dimmed. He went to scribing and completed the altered version of the orb of light spell. To his satisfaction, this little test worked. The spell activated, and the light was indeed dimmer, which proved his theory to be correct. The ones he was working here were probably fixed resistor types, as he didn't think he could alter the resistance mid-spell activation. There were also variable ones. As their names stated, they were in place to resist the injected energy that was mana. If he installed a variable resistor on a spell, then depending on the quality of the material, he might be able to switch it on the fly to get a stronger spell effect. It could also blow up in his face if he lowered it too much though. That's one down. Now to find all the other basic ones. Inductors, capacitors, amplifiers, fuses, and more. If he managed to distinguish between all of the basic circuit components that were in these magic runes, he would be able to alter the spells. What kind of changes he could bring he wasn't sure. Removing all of the resistance from the circuit would probably make the spell unstable. If he wanted to connect the various runic spells that he needed to know this. Maybe if he knew where to remove or add the basic rune circuit components, he would be able to correct all the badly made schematics he tried to combine. The fix could be really easy. Maybe he only needed to add another resistor to make a working fire gill arrow spell. Roland needed to get the basics down first before he moved on to the real meat and potatoes of these runes. Then he might be able to figure out the inner workings of the motors, components that were storing the spell programs inside. He gave out a sigh, understanding this would be hard. Luckily, he had a lot of time on his hands. He had signed a 3-year contract, and was getting charged less for these materials. His experience was increasing at a rapid rate, but the higher his level became, the harder it became to level it up. His hand moved to his stiff neck. He had spent the whole day working. He didn't feel tired. This was more interesting than he anticipated. He was slowly discovering how this magic runic language ticked, and it was making him all giddy. He just needed to stick with it, and maybe in due time, he would finally be a proper runic scholar. Chapter 27. Revisiting the Guild. Time passed and Roland was busy with his work. He had moved past his rudimentary understanding of runes. He didn't need to rely on copying his pre-drawn schematics to get his runic spells to work. He was even able to partially affect the spells, changing small things like their output, area of effect, and even some of the elemental variations. He had managed to single out some of the basic elements that were the easiest to work with. Fire, water, wind, and earth. He had compiled them into his notes and could now tell them apart from the others. This was still just a surface-level understanding, as he wasn't able to change the internal algorithm. What he could do now, for instance, was to change a water spell into a fire one, while working within some restrictions. He was mostly working with the basic types of spells like the mana arrow, mana bolt, and mana shield variations of them. He could now successfully create the lesser versions, and with them as a base, add elemental values that boosted their power output. His mana arrow could change into one from wind, fire, or water. The same with his shield spells that could transform from a semi-transparent blue sphere into a tightly formed wall of earth. This wasn't something he had achieved in a couple of days, no. He had already been working for another 6 months, which added up. He had already been in the city for over a year, and his research was showing some promise. Wish I wasn't limited to only cherry-picking these parts. Roland leaned back in his chair that had improved over this time frame. He had a new quill above his nose, and he was balancing it. The magic ink didn't really leave stains like the normal kind, and it also didn't leak. He had gone through his entire stash of runic spell scrolls that he could find in the city. They were mostly similar in the way that they created a magical force that rammed itself into its target. There wasn't much variation. He wanted some that could levitate objects or ones that affected your body in some way. These were buffing spells and debuffing spells. He had managed to procure a limited variety of them. There was also a plethora of runes that were used on equipment. This would be the next stage of his research. The runesmith territory. He had one worry though. He still needed to get his blacksmith class, and without the runecraft skill he wouldn't be able to further his research. This skill supposedly only became learnable in the later stages of the blacksmith class. The scrolls he was working with were far too fragile. After the runic spell activated, it would burn away at the magic ink. The ink would then seep into the scroll, and finally make it crumble into dust. He needed to constantly rescribe everything onto new spell scrolls, wasting precious time and resources. He had already tried scribing on some metal, but the magic ink had an adverse reaction to it, and he wasn't able to progress with it. He had runes like the impact rune, that when activated, while a warrior was swinging their weapon, increased the weapon's weight. He couldn't really experiment much with a spell like this. The paper scroll's weight increase was very meager, and he wasn't sure what good adding weight to an attack spell would do. Maybe you can make the magic arrows increase the weight while flying down at the monsters. But there is no human element to activate the spell at the right moment. I'd have to somehow predetermine the arrow's trajectory, and make it heavier during the descent. Otherwise, the added weight might make it fly slower. Could just make it heavier at the beginning and just add more mana, call it a heavy magic arrow, or heavy impact arrow. It was fine to speculate, but the scrolls that he was using did cost him some coins. He could make 50 iterations and see if one stuck and burn through his whole stock in the process. The best way would be if he could create some kind of reusable item that could fire off these spells. Like a magic staff. The problem was that he would only be able to do that after he achieved the runesmith class. He took his time to look at his status screen. He had progressed through the levels and was now on the 20th. This all while scribing many runic spells and crafting various schematics that pushed him forward. Name: Roland Arden, L45 classes. D1 Mage, L25. Secondary T1 Runic Mana, Scribe, L20 Main, P3, 193, 190 P, 2014, 2014 Sp 474, 474, Strength, 27. Agility 31, Dexterity, 65, Vitality 30, Endurance 30, Intelligence, 100, Willpower, 76, Charisma 14, Luck 7. He felt that in another half a year, he would reach the threshold and become a blacksmith. The problem with that was that he would need to go through a drastic change in professions. Scribing runes and making horseshoes didn't really vibe so well together. I wonder. He took another glance at his skills. His rune mastery skill that was L4 at the moment. It stood out like a sore thumb. It wasn't useful for crafting runes. Its role lied in combat. It decreased his mana expenditure while using runic equipment. It also lowered the mana requirements for boosting his scroll spells. He had a sneaking suspicion that he would regret it if he didn't get this skill up to L9 before trying to switch classes. He was inclined to believe that there might be some kind of special class waiting for him if he maxed this skill out. The biggest problem with this skill was that it required him to kill monsters. Also, using spells out of combat didn't level it up, as he tried casting the shield spell on himself and on some animals to no avail. Killing monsters didn't give him much experience and was also dangerous. He didn't really want to wander into the woods alone, as he knew the risks. Even if the monsters didn't get him, he could very well be attacked by some bandits or someone from an opposing business trying to get his secrets. He turned his thoughts towards the Adventurers Guild. There was no dungeon here, but that didn't mean that the guild members didn't hunt any monsters. They did sometimes organize expeditions into monster-infested lands for various reasons. He could join one of such undertakings as a support mage. He even managed to improve on his scroll design through this time period, which would increase his utility in a party. The more his scribing skill increased, the more he could compact the runic components. With time he managed to limit the scroll surface, which let him create more scrolls with fewer materials. The difficulty of the crafting process increased several-fold though. He needed to fit the complete rune diagram on something that was half the size of the scroll paper that he had been using. His aim was to fit a common grade spell onto a surface that was the size of a regular playing card. He could then just flip through them and spam his spells. The most he could manage now is fitting them on something the size of an envelope. This was already much smaller than the scrolls he was using. Surprisingly, even though he was using less magic ink on the smaller scrolls, the runic spells didn't drop in power. It was like creating a smaller processor that, even if smaller than the original one, didn't have to be worse. There was a little drawback though. The smaller scrolls couldn't be overloaded as much as the larger ones. The user had the option to insert their mana to make the spell stronger, but the smaller scrolls just couldn't handle the increase in mana that well. This was more a problem in the materials not being able to handle it, and not the rune diagram itself. Should I take a break? He had implemented a vacation period that he could begin any time, and had it placed in the contract as a clause. He was allowed to take the weekends off. He also had 25 days to pick his non-working ones throughout the entire year. He could also prepare the minimum number of scrolls a few weeks early if he really needed a longer break. His aim was not to level himself up, but to level his rune mastery skill. He needed to get it up to level 9 before hitting his cap. He wasn't sure if that was achievable, but he was even willing to wait before he got it there. Luckily, he had already prepared by scribing some scrolls in his free time. His social life became even more non-existent due to this. He didn't even know what was happening outside anymore. Time to walk among the people had come. He was still a steel-grade adventurer, even though he didn't do any work for a year. He would probably be able to find a spot in an expedition, but it would take him away from here for at least a week. Thanks to the increase in both his mage and scribing skills, he was a lot faster now. His high-end stats showed its worth at times like this. A year ago, when he first started, he could barely produce a runic fire arrow scroll in a day. Now he could make 5 or 6 of them, and even compact them onto smaller paper. This wasn't his only spell that he had. He had bought out all the possible spell scrolls in Edelgard, and also asked the manager to procure him ones that were common grade or below. His scrolls were quite popular with the adventurers, and were even getting shipped to other cities along with his signature. People came up with some nicknames for his crafting persona. Due to the red comet-looking mark that he stamped every scroll with, they gave him names like Crimson Comet, Red Star, or the Scarlet Runesmith. Some others just called him an idiot for making so many rune spell scrolls, and not making any runic weapons instead. He was known for only making high or highest grade spell scrolls. The biggest factor to his popularity was that these scrolls were actually worth the coin that was spent on them. After taking into account the price of crafting materials and craftsmanship, they were deemed affordable. They were quite loved by support-type classes that had higher levels of mana compared to the warrior classes. Acolytes and priests could use them for protection, and even add to the firepower against boss-level monsters. The superiority of runic scrolls against the regular spell scrolls once again came to light as finally some affordable ones were finally being made. Roland moved down from his chair and got his coat. His workroom looked kind of messy. There were piles of research material, sketches, and his scribbles everywhere. He still kept the most important stuff on himself though, as the rune schematics. He had asked the elf girl how much a schematic of a rune spell could go for. The answer made his eyes pop out. He could use them as a last-ditch effort if he really needed money, but for now, it was better to keep them to himself. He walked out. He had improved his gear slightly. He was wearing a set of fine gambeson under his robe. He spent most of his money on the spell scrolls, so he couldn't really get anything fancy like magical armor. This was quite good for a mage, as it was quite light, while offering a lot of protection against regular attacks. He still had the heavy rapier that he received after the battle with that fencer. Besides that, his shoes were made from leather, and he was wearing matching gloves. He wished that he could get himself some spell-sliding gloves, but they cost far too much. There was also a problem with those items, as they broke down after some uses. Just like the scrolls, the mana would corrode the materials, which meant that if he wanted a reusable resource, he would need ones that were at least made from mithril. This silvery metal was one of the best around when it came to runic gear. It came at a huge cost. He wouldn't be able to get anything below a large golden coin made with it. The sliding doors opened up and he could see the sun being still up. Even though people were giving him nicknames involving the color red, he was still wearing black clothes. If he switched to red, he felt like he would be sticking out like a sore thumb. He walked towards the adventurer house while looking at his old adventurer card. He hadn't really been using it since coming here. He had wandered into the goblin-infested forests from time to grind his skills though. The goblins proved to not be the best training as they were far too weak. This is also the reason why he decided to take up a request from the guild. He wanted to join a larger expedition, where he could kill monsters that were stronger and offered more experience. He pushed the doors of the guild open and was greeted to a familiar sight. The arrangements in this building were similar to the one in Carwin. This also made him remember his old party of misfits. He wondered what those 3 girls were up to after over a year had passed. He frowned slightly as thinking about the past wasn't very productive. He moved towards the notice board and started looking. There were a large plethora of quests being hung up there. Some of them even to subjugate goblins. He did always bring back the ears with him, as they were worth a couple of coins. Is there anything worthwhile? There weren't many nearby monsters around the city, so the goblin forest was as far as he could go without getting into too much trouble. There were more ferocious monsters living in the uninhabited lands further into the kingdom. He reasoned that there should be some jobs that he could take, and that wouldn't keep him away from his work for longer than 2 weeks. Let me see protect convoy from bandits while traveling to the city of Stegend. That one is a bit too far. It would take a whole week, and I bet the caravan would stop between the other towns. He rejected that one. The possibility of meeting monsters or bandits was questionable, and he wanted to use up his spell scrolls to level up his skill. He started going through listings. They were all mostly protection missions placed by the merchants. They were always happy to hire some extra muscle to be extra safe. There were also some jobs asking for exploration, or for finding missing people or caravans. His eyes finally stopped at one job in particular. Investigate and clear out Mansto's grotto from the monster infestation. He started reading through this one. The description stated that this grotto was in fact an iron ore mine which also has some rarer metals in the deeper parts. The miners had broken through a wall and tunneled right into some kind insectoid monster nest. There had already been some casualties, and the mine was now closed off. Roland rubbed his chin. There were monsters he could kill there. The only problem was that it was in some kind of mine shaft. How wide the corridors were was unknown, and if the whole thing collapsed onto him, he didn't think a rescue party would be coming. He wouldn't be going in alone though. This was a large-scale operation with more than one small team involved. He was also a mage, so he would be allowed to hang out in the back while the warriors took all the hits. The risk might have been worth the rewards, and he would get bonuses by killing more monsters. He went through the other listings again, but didn't find anything worthwhile. This mine wasn't that far, they could get there in a day or two. He didn't think that killing the monsters would take that long either. He nodded, and went over to the guild receptionist. He presented his card and told the person that he wanted to sign up for this expedition. The mission didn't seem to have any rank requirements though. His steel rank allowed him to be accepted, but being a mage also added to his worth. He left soon afterward, as they would be heading out in 2 days. He could use this time to prepare and scribe some more spell scrolls. Having more ammo was also advantageous. He was also interested in testing some of his altered spells on the monsters. The 2 days of preparation passed in a flash. He had gathered what he could. Besides his spell scrolls, he had some healing potions and some rations, all nicely packed into his storage bag. When he arrived, he saw a group of tough-looking adventurers already gathering up. There were about 20 people here, and they would be probably splitting into 5 or 4 parties. There was also someone he knew here, a certain small half-gnome girl, that was apparently coming with them on this adventure. Before he could ask about why they allowed a low-level adventurer like her to come with them, he was spotted. The girl's eyes went wide, then they narrowed. She zoned in on him, probably recognizing him by the black robe that he was wearing. This would probably be quite an interesting expedition. He hoped that the girl could at least keep herself safe this time around. Chapter 28. Setting out on an expedition. Some time had passed since Helsai's first expedition into the forest. That was something she considered a big failure. She couldn't kill a single goblin and had to be rescued by some kid, and she even got berated her for it. She did manage to level up once. The goblin that she injured had chased after her, and was finished off by the human mage that rescued her. She gained part of the shared experience after the kill and managed to level up. This incident made her rethink her approach. She wasn't strong enough to wander alone into the forests. She also figured out that the white goblins that were in this forest were stronger than the regular green ones. She was a scout. This was a combat class, while also a utility class, so she needed to increase her combat and detection skills. She didn't receive any free weapon proficiencies, as they needed to be trained by herself. She needed to increase her basic dagger proficiencies and maybe the short sword ones. She was a class relying on agility and wouldn't be good with heavier weapons. With their good eyesight, a scout made a good archer, but they mostly needed to use short bows or crossbows due to their lack of strength. Contrary to popular belief, archers relied more on strength than dexterity, as they needed enough power to draw their large longbows. The dexterity and good vision then added to their aiming proficiencies. After the first level, she had received a basic trap-finding skill. Before that she only had a passive that allowed her to see better and spot hidden enemies. It only worked on them if they weren't hiding or their skill in stealth was really low. The half-gnome girl had decided to first train a bit, increasing her passive weapon proficiencies along with doing basic strength training. While at it, she also made sure to visit the Adventurer Guild, hoping that she could get a job there. To her dismay, not many people wanted to take in a bronze-class scout into their mids that was only on their first class. The other adventurers didn't want to put their faith in an inexperienced tracker. Someone that could detect the enemies before they ambushed you was a cornerstone of every party. They were sometimes even considered more valuable than mages or priests. Time continued to pass. In the day, she worked at the inn, while in the evening she did her training. She was quite diligent and even managed to level up thanks to increasing some of the basic combat skills. She had never trained before and had gone through her first class change. People who didn't train the basic skills beforehand would find them leveling up faster after attaining a class. After a few months of hard work, she had her break. She managed to land a spot in a party. She agreed on lower wages, and was more or less a tag-along extra. Her first job was to protect a caravan that would take her on a 2-week trip back and forth. The pay wasn't great, but she still took it. This forced her to quit her job at the inn. The innkeeper wasn't happy about an abrupt leaving of his worker, but he could do nothing but shrug. The first quest unfolded with some strains. their party was attacked by some wolf-looking monsters. They managed to clear them out with only a couple of people injured. Soon she started leveling up and her adventure life had finally begun. She found the encounter very exciting, and was hoping for more, but to her dismay, it wasn't always so action-packed. Her party spent 2 weeks walking in front of a cart, and sometimes riding it. The monster attacks were rare, and she felt bored. The sleeping conditions were even worse than at the inn, as they either slept outside, or in one of the carriages. She even had to deal with the male members snoring all night long. She also didn't like the looks that some of the adventurers were giving her. Luckily, she wasn't the only female in the group, and they never went too far. Her new party consisted of her as a scout, 2 warriors, a girl that was an archer, and another scout that was already in his second Tier 1 class that was a tracker. This was a popular class to take along with a scout, as it also had monster detection qualities along with basic pathfinding skills. Everyone besides her was a steel rank, so she was the newbie of the group. She had to do things like cooking or washing their dirty clothes. She knew that they didn't consider her a real party member just yet, but she had to catch up to everyone. Their ages were all comparable to her, as she had a late start. The days continued to pass, and she never returned to the inn. Her levels were slowly rising, but without any dungeon nearby, her progress was meager. Her party didn't want to move to another city, as they were okay with easy transport work. She, on the other hand, wanted more. She wanted to get stronger and earn some respect. One day, I brought news of the expedition to Mansto's grotto, and how it was mostly about exterminating a monster infestation. To her surprise, the party refused this request, telling her that it sounded sketchy. There wasn't enough info about the monsters, and the inside of the caves might not be correctly mapped out. They were the types that liked to play it safe, so they refused the request. She went away fuming. She didn't want to do the protection missions anymore. They had spent the past 4 months doing those, and she was still only a level 10. She wanted to progress faster, but was afraid to head out on her own. Luckily, this expedition was accepting almost everyone, even bronze adventurers could join. To the protests of her party, she decided to go there as a solo act. They didn't want to budge, even after she asked them again and again. This wasn't considered a betrayal of trust or anything. It wasn't rare for adventurers to change parties, and to join larger expeditions like this on their own. They wished her good luck, and to come back in one piece. She arrived early in the morning, almost before anyone had gathered. She took her time to examine her dagger and short bow that she was now using. She was wearing light armor, and the same leather vest was still on her, as she didn't have enough coin to make a drastic change to her gear. She also looked at her status screen, while wondering how she compared to others at her level. Name: Hels, I Scout L10, P2, 142, 140 P1, 176, 1, 176, SP 335, 335 Strength, 15, Agility 30 Dexterity, 25 Vitality, 18 Endurance, 20 Intelligence, 12 Willpower, 14 Charisma, 15 Luck 9. Scout class increases stamina regeneration by 20%, improves vision by 25%. When she asked the person that had the same class as her about his stats, he just laughed. He explained to her that she shouldn't ask or reveal her status screen to anyone. It was actually considered rude to do this unless you had some kind of strong bond with the person you were asking. The people that were going to go on this expedition started gathering together. There were a variety of classes here, but most of them looked to be warriors, with some archers and scouts sprinkled in. There were 2 people sticking out like a sore thumb. One was a youth with golden hair. He was wearing a long white robe, and had a large symbol of a sun embroidered on his back. He was holding a large book in his right hand, and was praying while looking in the direction of the rising sun. He was obviously either an acolyte or a priest. The second person was also wearing a robe. It was only pitch black. He had a heavy rapier strapped to his side, and was above 160 cm in height. She recognized the gloomy robe, and the lanky youth that was standing there. It was the same brat that had saved her from the mountain goblins that one day. Their eyes met, and the 2 started looking at each other. Roland was surprised to see the waitress from the inn even more than she was surprised to see him here. She was still the only person that he knew around here, so he just nodded with his head, as a sort of greeting. Else, I was slightly taken aback after Roland had nodded at her. She wasn't as annoyed with him anymore, and she felt a bit back about how she acted after he had saved her. Still, she just nodded back at him, and then turned around as she didn't really have anything to talk about with him. There were exactly 20 adventurers here plus the person in command. This person raised his hand, and gave a shout to make himself noticeable. He looked to be a man of about 180 cm in height. He had a robust stature, and was of the human race. His hair was brown, and he had a short beard. The thing that made him stand out was that he was wearing blue brigandine armor. It was made from either heavy cloth or leather and lined with small oblong steel plates riveted to the fabric. The rivets were sticking out as little round metal circles outside this heavy cloth. The advantage of this armor was that it wasn't a single piece of metal and allowed better movement. Roland had done some research, as he was soon to reach the blacksmith class, and knew that this type of armor was also easier to manufacture or repair than plate mail. He was also wearing some heavy cloth under it, which was the ever-popular gambeson. The man looked to be in his later 20s or in his early 30s, which prompted Roland to believe that he was at least a Tier 2 class. Besides the armor, he also had a long sword strapped to his side that was probably enchanted. "You can call me Wells. I'll be taking the lead in this expedition. We have 20 members, from which 15 already have their own parties. The rest will form the fourth." The man started listing down some basic info. He didn't add much. The exact kind of insectoid monster was unknown, and the mine had been barricaded from the outside so that the monsters wouldn't wander out. Now they were waiting for the adventurers to move inside and clear them out. They would be the first organized party to go in. Roland was more interested in the party he was getting. He was going solo, so he would be joining the fourth party that was forced together. Wells was the one that brought them together, and he started calling the solo adventurers out while also listing their main classes. Dowrak, Dwarf Shield Warrior, Steel Rank. Roland saw a robust-looking dwarf move out from the crowd and move towards where the leader was. His beard wasn't all that long and he looked young. He was also wearing heavier plate armor with a chain shirt underneath. Cylinder, Sun Elf Tracker and Archer, Steel Rank. This time, it was a tall lanky elf. He was wearing light green leather armor and carrying around a longbow over his shoulder. He had all the usual fine elven features that all Sun Elves had: long golden hair and a pretty face. Orson, Human 2-handed Sword Warrior, Steel Rank. All of his party members were of the Steel Rank apparently. This one was also a youth that didn't look older than 18. He was above 180 cm in height and was wearing a metal cuirass over his chest. His arm and leg protection was lighter, probably due to him having a large sword to swing around. He looked like your usual damage dealer by game standards. Roland, Human Mage, Steel Rank. He was finally called to action, so he walked over towards his new group. The others gave him some looks that soon subsided. The last is Helsehaf, Gnome Scout, Bronze Rank. The leader narrowed his eyes while reading the last member's name. She was the lowest ranked party member and caused everyone to look. The girl noticed the scornful looks, but she was already used to them. She knew that she was still green. Still, it was quite annoying to be looked down upon by people that were of similar age as her. While Roland's and Helsai's group gathered up, the leader continued talking. The priest-looking person that was seen by Hels, I was brought to the forefront. This is Priest Elric. He will be joining our expedition, and as a special guest he won't be joining any of the parties. The leader explained that the priest was getting a special status in the group. It was their responsibility to protect him from harm, as he was able to heal the people from the expedition. Roland thought that mages were seen as assets, but maybe being a healer was even more important. Praise the sun, my children. Let the sun goddess watch over you and warm your souls with her eternal sunshine. The moment he got to the forefront, he started preaching. The adventurers looked at each other while trying not to show their disdain. It was understandable that the priest classes were important assets and they needed to be protected. This didn't change the fact that most of them were considered to be religious zealots. If you asked them about Solaria, they could talk you to sleep while conversing about her greatness from dusk till dawn. From what Roland could tell, the expedition consisted mostly of steel-grade adventurers. There were a few Tier 2 classes on board. One was the expedition leader and the other was the priest. He also believed that the party the leader was in was probably mostly composed of Tier 2s as well. Roland had a suspicion that besides that main group of adventurers, all of the rest were considered expendable meat shields. His group would be getting one carriage to travel, and so they would have enough time to strategize and get to know each other. Though there was a problem already, mainly one of the members wasn't happy that they had a bronze adventurer with them. "What is this? I didn't sign up to babysit shitty little bronze brats. Who are you calling a brat? You're not even much older than me." The ones fighting were Orson and Helsay, the half-gnome. Apparently, the man didn't like that they had a bronze rank with them. The small girl was staring daggers at him and stomping her foot on the ground. "Ah, what? You want to go, shrimp?" The man grinned while looking down at the small girl and started egging her on. Roland saw this and knew that in a party, it would be better if the team worked with each other. He decided to move closer in the hopes of diffusing the situation, even though he didn't like talking to people all that much. "I don't think we should be fighting before we even arrive at the grotto. Save it for the monsters." The elf and dwarf didn't seem to care that much as they moved toward the carriage that they were going to use. Another shrimp appeared. "We having a bargain sale or something?" "The only shrimp I see is between your ears," Roland replied hastily, his emotions getting to him. Before he could backtrack on his insult, he heard the dwarf bursting out in laughter. "He get you there good, laddie." Orson's face turned a bit red, and the half-gnome girl also got out a chuckle from Roland's remark. Cylinder, the sun elf, remained quiet while just sighing. He was one of the more silent types. "Stop your nonsense." The dwarf could see that this human here was on the angrier side. He had enough sense, as the main tank, to not let things escalate. Luckily Orson was more bark than bite, and they all managed to get inside the carriage without a fight breaking out. He did curse up a storm before getting into it. It was quite the quiet trip. The most talkative one was Dalrak, that kept complaining about the bumpy road, and how much his posterior hurt. Roland had worked in a more tight-knit group of adventurers and knew that good cooperation was key. He decided to at least try to talk with them to figure out what he was working with. Dalrak, was it? How good are you with that shield, and is that a polearm? Aye, this air? Did ye think it'd be used in an axe or something? The dwarf asked while chuckling. Dwarves were considered strong for their height, but they lacked reach. This is why most of them favored weapons that had long reach like spears and polearms. They also used longswords or even bastard swords. The one Dalrak was using was a slightly shorter halberd, fit for his height. You would very rarely see a dwarf using an axe. This mostly happened when they were wearing full plate armor and were sure that they could just charge into their enemy without worry. I'd teach frontline teamy, not in his aft get by me. Roland couldn't understand the heavy accent too well, but he figured the dwarf was just reassuring him about his defensive capabilities. And Mr. Cylinder, nothing will escape my elven eyes, leave the tracking to me. Before he could even ask, the elf answered. He probably realized what Roland's intention was and just answered so that he wouldn't have to beat around the bush. I'm also good at scouting and trap finding. Hells, I chimed in while everyone was talking. The group started to slowly converse with each other during the carriage ride. Even Orson finally gave in and listed his two-handed sword abilities. Roland also informed them about the array of spells that he was able to cast. He had made a lot of regular mana bolt and mana arrow spell scrolls that fit on smaller paper. He could use them to level up and only dip into the better ones if they run into trouble. If they asked, he could just say that he knew a high-level runesmith that liked scribing. The close to 2-day ride continued. Soon Roland would get another taste of adventuring after having had taken a long break. Chapter 29. Entering the Mine. Ember. Roland held out his hand in front of a bundle of sticks that were gathered in one place. He was a mage without elemental affinities, but he could still learn the spell. It used friction instead of fire to ignite. The sticks went up in flames, and Roland's new half-gnome companion tossed a few more in. The expedition had stopped for the night, and they decided to camp out in the wilderness. They would make it to their destination in half a day's time tomorrow. The leader had decided that it was too dangerous to wander during the night. Making a camp and having people take turns watching would be the best option. Roland and Hels, I were voted to be the first ones with guard duty. The girl was selected because she was a scout and also a newbie. Roland was also forced here due to his young age. He was now sitting opposite to the short girl with orange hair. Did you cut your hair? Roland asked while tossing some more wood into the pile. It was quite chilly here, and even while wearing this long robe, he was feeling cold. Ah, yes. The girl nodded. She did have longer hair when Roland had saved her that fateful day. After she gained some experience, she decided to cut it short, as it was a liability during fights. But Roland felt like the two got off on the wrong foot the first time they met. He also felt like that, as the adult here, he should offer her the olive branch. Problem was that he didn't really know how to talk to 16-year-old girls, even fewer ones that were from this word and a gnome. Thank you. Huh? You know, for saving me. The girl finally managed to gather up her courage to apologize. She had her head turned the other side, while twiddling her thumbs. Her voice faint and quiet as Roland barely heard it. After going through the adventurer's lifestyle, the half-gnome did have a lot of time to think about her past actions. Sure, no problem. Also sorry for shouting at you back then. No, it's fine, you were right, I was unprepared. The two somehow managed to bury the hatchet, so Roland moved on from this uncomfortable topic and shifted it to another. The two started talking about the adventurer life. Hills. I also wanted to know how Roland was able to get his adventurer rank at such a young age. He just lied and told her that he was lucky enough to get a mage class, which let him join adventurer parties at a dungeon. The night went by slowly. There wasn't much to do but talk, so they slowly got to know each other. Hills. I told him about what she was up to after she got rescued, and Roland gave her a recap of his adventurer life back in Carwin. Come to think of it, it would probably be better for you to go to a city with a dungeon than to stay here if you want to level up. I also had trouble working by myself back then. I was lucky enough to find a good party. He gave her his opinion. If she really wanted to level up, going to a city with a dungeon would probably be faster. Still, going on simple escort missions was probably safer, as you never knew what could appear in a dungeon. Sometimes some rare monster variants appeared on the top levels that could easily kill the low-level adventurers. In contrast, bandits and the surface-level monsters were a lot easier to handle. You think so? The small girl crossed her arms together and moved her head down. She started thinking about something and went quiet. Roland went on with more advice, hoping that it would be at least somewhat helpful. You could also try finding some bronze adventurers there and practice on the easier levels. You sound really knowledgeable for your age. Are you really a human kid, or just a large halfling in disguise? The girl narrowed her eyes while looking at Roland that wasn't behaving for his age. She even expected him to act more bashful with such beauty as herself. But there he was talking normally and just acting like some kind of mentor figure. He never even tried to sneak a peek at her figure like all the other male adventurers. He looked to be 13, so he should have been at that age. This was a hit to her femininity. Halflings are only a meter tall. Then, a giant halfling. You might be really old. Stop talking nonsense. How would a giant and halfling even copulate? There was an actual giant race in this world, but they were various types ranging from 3-4 meters all the way up to a staggering number. See that? That's not how a brat talks. Oh, would brat act more like you then? Yes, more like a hey. Roland laughed a bit while the half-gnome girl stared him down. She even threw one of the smaller sticks at him, which he caught with his hand, and just threw back at her. Before a stick fight could break out, another person walked over. This was someone from the other teams to switch them out. Roland didn't remain there for long and headed back to the tent that the rest of their party members were sleeping in. This was probably the worst part of this journey, sleeping in a small tent with 4 other people. Ugh, that's why dwarves are hells, I complained, as even before they could enter the tent they could hear loud snoring. The dwarf, being a dwarf, had drunk himself to sleep. This also caused him to snore like a bear. The half-gnome girl never liked sleeping next to guys for this reason. At least in her old party, there was another girl, and she sometimes got to sleep in a tent with her without the other companions. I'm surprised that those other 2 are managing, Roland commented as Orson and Selenar were fast asleep, though the elf had an awkward sitting up straight position and looked to be awake. The human, on the other hand, was similarly snoring as Dowrak the dwarf. They probably both drunk themselves to sleep, while the elf might have used some sleeping aids. The 2 walked in. They only had some crude blankets and hard pillows provided by the people from the expedition. Helse, I curled up to the side far away from the other 3 males, and tried to sleep, but the snoring was just too loud. She then noticed someone wiggling over towards her, which was Roland wrapped up in a blanket. Hey, what are you doing? Go back, you pervert. The half-gnome was surprised that the youth that didn't show interest in her looks had come over. Was he actually keeping it in, but was in reality a wolf in sheep's clothing? Pervert? The hell? Just be quiet. He started murmuring something to himself, and after a while, a little flash of light occurred. Surprisingly, Helse, I couldn't hear the snoring of the 2 other men now. She glanced at Roland, that had an unimpressed, judgy expression on his face. Hush spell, it places a small dome that keeps sounds outside, best used against snoring drunkards. Now go to sleep, it will only last 30 minutes. The youth then rolled over to the side, so that Helse, I could only see the back of his head. She realized that he only came over here because the spell had a limited range. There were some lesser spells like this that Roland could practice even without an elemental affinity. The 30 minutes should be enough for the 2 to fall asleep. While already asleep, they should be okay with the snoring. Next morning when Roland woke up, he felt that something was off. He felt something heavy on top of him. It was a person, and he or she was right on top of him. He opened his eyes, and to his dismay it was Dalrak. He even got a nice whiff of his breath as the dwarf opened up his mouth while yawning. Get off me! Roland began pushing and pushing, but the man on top of him was quite heavy. He was already level 45 and somehow managed to do it, even with his meager strength stat. The others were awoken to Roland's grunts and could see him rolling the sleeping dwarf to the side while panting. Hey, what are you looking at? Orson and Selenar looked at each other, while slowly backing away. Helse, I was also looking at the strange display while mumbling to herself. Now it all makes sense. Roland raised his brow and just got up. He wanted to give Dalrak's rear end a good kick, but decided otherwise. He just left the tent, while the other party members continued looking at the sleeping dwarf that was about to wake up. After the rowdy night, everyone packed up their belongings and the tents and placed them back into the carriages as they continued with their journey. Roland somehow managed to explain himself, while Dalrak just laughed about the whole misunderstanding. He even mentioned that Roland was far too skinny for his tastes, and that he only liked the robust dwarven women. Then, for the rest of the trip, he started explaining the beauty of white women, and how they were superior to what he called twigs. Aye, that's what a real whiffy is. This damn dwarf makes a lot of sense, Orson replied, with a surprising contemplative look on his face, as if he was deliberating on switching over. The elf remained silent just as Roland, the half-gnome girl, had her eyes narrowed throughout the whole conversation. The carriages soon arrived at the grotto and everything came to a stop. Dalrak's spirited discussion would have to wait until this was over. The leader's shout soon could be heard as he barked out some orders. Everyone gather up! It took a couple of minutes for everyone to reach the meeting place. The party stood next to each other while looking over their weapons. There was a large wide river by which the grotto was located. The natural entrance to the grotto had its base part submerged in water. The opening was close to the river, which caused it to be in the water, behind it a large mountain. People started out by using the natural opening at first, but afterward they had created a separate entrance for easier access that was located closer to land. They had also sealed off part of the old mine shaft that connected to the natural grotto, as it kept flooding the pathways. The mine was dug into the mountain, going up and down in several spots. The miners made sure to dig in the opposite direction of the river. This did save them from flooding but didn't protect them from the monster invasion. Listen up. There are several openings to the mine. We will split up here. Wells started explaining the battle plan. Due to the sheer amount of mine shafts that spread in the mountain like spider webs, they were going to split up. Everyone was given a map with the marked mineshaft opening that they would be going through. The miners escaped quickly, so the exact location of the breach wasn't marked down. Roland already saw a big problem with this strategy. They didn't have any sort of communication device with them. Things like that existed in this world, but they were items that cost a lot of money and used up a lot of mana. Even if they found the source of the monsters, they wouldn't be able to call for help. The plan was for the teams to locate this location and then retreat so that the main party, that was composed of Tier 2 fighters, could move in and do the heavy lifting. They could also try to do it on their own, if they were confident. This would increase the monetary rewards that they would be getting. Roland wasn't sure about the level of these monsters, so he wasn't sure if he would be doing any deep diving. The important priest that had come along would also leave with the expedition leader's team, which made things even more dangerous. Everyone got their assignments. There is enough time, so move out. We will meet back here at nightfall. It was about 1 p.m. at the moment. They still have some time to do a sweep of the tunnels before nightfall. If the monsters were active during the day was unknown, so they had to expect resistance on the inside. They weren't the only people here. There was a whole enclosed camp with some guards and miners. They had some wooden buildings that consisted of the miners' dining quarters and storage areas. There was also a nearby village from which most of the workers came from. Each party was guided to the mineshaft opening by some of the workers. Once Roland's party got there, the miners started removing some of the rocks that they placed to block the mineshaft. Guards were placed in front of the entrance as protection. There were no signs of battle, so the monsters probably hadn't escaped the mine just yet. So what do you think? Roland asked. About dwarf women? Orson replied. What? Know about this mission? The man just shrugged while taking out his long two-handed sword. It looked thick and heavy and hard to swing. Roland was slightly worried that this large weapon could be hard to use inside a tight mineshaft. I don't care, just here to kill some monsters. Orson performed a practice swing, and the sword gave out a nice swishing sound. Roland spotted a shorted sword strapped to the man's side. This made him slightly less worried, as he had enough sense to have a sidearm. "'Tis just some bugs. You worry awfully much, laddie, it's just some bugs. You worry too much, boy." Dalrak just laughed while getting his shield and halberd out. The elf wasn't looking too happy about having to get himself into a mine shaft. The half-gnome girl was just looking over her dagger and short bow. Fighting ability of those two might be hampered if the corridors got too narrow. They wouldn't really be able to use their ranged weapons, though if their aim was good, they could probably shoot without hitting their own allies. Roland was a bit perplexed about his new party members. They were awfully lax and didn't seem to be taking this expedition seriously. He was wondering if he was being overly cautious about it or not. He decided to check his own gear over. To the side he had his makeshift spellbook. It wasn't the only one, as he had attached 4 of them to his belt with a stack of 10 spell scrolls in each. He had far more firepower than last time. Fire arrows weren't the only spell that he could cast anymore. He also had a larger stack of the lesser runic mana arrow and mana bolt spell scrolls with him. He would be using these most of the time to level his skill up. There were other various spells that he had hidden in his storage bag, as he couldn't just carry all of them on him. He hoped that his bad feelings about this mission would go away. Having a whole team of Tier 2s to back them up was also a reassurance. While thinking, he heard a cracking sound followed by the noise of falling rocks. The miners had broken through the barricade and were now slowly moving the rocks away. The guards examined the entrance and deemed it safe for the workers to continue. Roland's party also moved closer, as a monster could pop out at any moment. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, let's get this over with. He moved to the back of the party. Dalrak and Cylinder moved to the forefront. The dwarf was the main tank, and the elf was responsible for spotting monsters. Even in a cave, he would probably be able to somehow feel out the enemies if they were close, thanks to his class and skills. Orson remained in the back with Hels, to protect the party from sneak attacks from the rear, and Roland, as the mage, was right in the middle. After the miners broke through the opening, the party ventured forward. Instead of torches, Roland produced one of the easiest light spells, a mana sphere that lit the way. This was a lot better than having to hold on to torches that also brought smoke into the equation. Everyone steeled their resolve as they moved forward, going in slowly into the unknown. The real expedition had finally started. Chapter 30. Fighting Monsters in a Mine. Roland's party had to squeeze through a small opening that the miners made. This opening was then covered up and only a small head-sized hole remained. When the party returned, they were supposed to communicate with the people on the other side through it. They were also told to knock on the wall in a sort of Morse code so that the workers knew it was them. On the other side, guards were stationed to keep the miners safe from harm. The adventurers were supposed to follow the map and slowly clear out the tunnels from any monsters. Along with the other adventure teams, they would slowly get rid of the monster infestation. It was unsure on how long this would take, but they were given simple clocks, so that they could tell the time spent there and go out within 5 hours of going in. A blue sphere of light illuminated the tunnel. This tunnel was wide enough for 3 people to fit in side by side. Small railroad tracks were lined up on the hard rocky floor. There was also an empty minecart standing there on those tracks. It was probably used by the miners to carry iron ore and minerals to and from the exit. Handy teehee a mage around. Handy to have a mage around, Dalrak said while moving forward. The magic light hovered above his head. Roland could position it there as it had a targeting function. This spell didn't take much mana to sustain, and Roland's mana regeneration outperformed it. Thanks to this, the party could enjoy a well-lit tunnel while having their hands free of torches. They spotted some of those torches on the walls, but they were all unlit. They probably burned out after the tunnels were sealed. Silinar was holding on to the map. He was a tracker, but his strengths lay in the wilderness and forests. He wasn't that good at distinguishing rocky mine walls and remembering the tunnel layouts. He stopped, and so did the others with him as he frowned. "Can I take a look? I'm good with maps," Roland called out to the elf as he saw him, narrowing his eyes while looking at the parchment. Silinar didn't mind and just handed it over to Roland, as he was more than willing to shift responsibility. The scribe class and his high intelligence helped him with maps. It was as if he had an internal GPS. He had also gained a map reading skill that probably made everything possible. "Okay, we are here." He had looked through the map before but was still surprised that someone could dig in so many tunnels without modern drilling equipment. Supposedly a miner was also a class, and their skills made tunneling and digging a breeze. "If we follow this path, we'll come to a fork. The right path will lead to more tunnels that are a dead end." Roland proposed to check out the tunnels that were a dead end first before moving on to the other ones. This way they could see if the monsters were tunneling any further, and would also let them cut off the monsters' escape route. This would also help them cross out already searched sections from the map easier. The others didn't really care that much. The faster they got through this, the faster they could get their rewards. So they all nodded and followed the directions that Roland proposed. While going past the first fork in the road, Silinar noted that no monsters had gone through here, as he could only spot the miners' footprints going this way. Without making any shocking discoveries, they marched through these tunnels. Just as the elf said, there were no monsters found in these unfinished tunnels. Hells, I made sure to observe the beautiful-looking male elf as he examined the path. She was also someone that was aiming for a tracker role as him. Roland marked the dead ends on the map, a bit disgruntled that he didn't find any type of loot to take with him. He wanted to nab some metal or samples for himself, as he was going to be working with metals in the future. They backtracked to the fork, and went further each time, taking the path that placed them at a dead end. This trudge continued for an hour until they finally spotted their first enemy, revealing the true appearance of the insect monsters to them. Ugh, it just had to be those. What stood before them was a troublesome foe. It wasn't troublesome due to its strength. It wasn't even a particular hard enemy to kill. The troubling part was that it rarely was seen alone. It was a giant ant monster, and they were now looking at a worker type. This ant was the size of a large dog breed. When it spotted the party, its feelers started wiggling about, and its mandibles started gnashing in their direction. Before it could act, an arrow buried itself into its eye. The monster was stunned and practically dead, which allowed Silinar to finish the job with another well-aimed arrow to the head. "Fucking mimics," Orson called out after the mimic worker drew its last breath. Everyone from the adventurers knew that this type of monster was tricky. They came in droves. There were always more giant ants around if you spotted one. They must have burrowed from their nest here, might be even in the process of making this mine their new lair, Roland said while looking at the dead monster. Depending on the level of the ant queen, this could be dangerous. Though if she wasn't above a certain level, then the ant monsters would be quite weak, and they would be fine. The worker ants weren't that strong, but if they piled upon you, it was certain death. "What's so scary about these ants? They don't look so tough." Hells, I called out. She didn't see a problem in this, as the ant was easily dispatched by 2 arrows. The other adventurers gave her dumbfounded gazes, as if they were looking at an idiot. "Why are you looking at me like that for?" She stomped her foot on the ground as she noticed those spiteful gazes. "That's why bronze newbies are worse," and snorted while the half-gnome girl glared back at him. Roland took this chance to educate her about the dangers of organized monsters that actually had a leader. The ant workers and soldiers would give their life for the queen, and they could communicate with each other. The biggest danger lied in their organized hive mind-like behavior. "I bet we'll be seeing more of them coming here now. Get ready. I think the miners might have lied about this, probably to save some coin." Everyone beside Hells, I nodded, as they knew that a monster ant was considered a more dangerous enemy. The commission they would have to pay would increase accordingly. They could always lie if the first expedition turned out to be a failure, and if the job wasn't completed they wouldn't have to pay the entire sum. The one in charge was probably willing to endanger the adventurers' lives, just to save a couple of silver coins. "More are approaching." Silinar called out to the party and everyone got ready, even Hells. I pulled out her short bow. "Get behind me." Dalrak moved to the front. The corridor was a bit wider, so they had enough space to move around. Roland shifted his hand to his belt, where one of his binder-like scroll grimoires was attached to. It was quite plump with a lot of the smaller versions of the scrolls. He held it forward and pretended to be muttering an incantation before firing off a deep blue-colored bolt of mana. An unlucky giant ant monster that was first to appear got the brunt of the hit. The blue bolt of mana energy slammed into its head that promptly exploded into many chunks. Green blood leaked everywhere. Roland wouldn't let this chance slip by. He had a large quantity of these lesser mana bolts and mana arrows with him. He brought them just so he could level up his runic mastery skill. The only problem was that he wasn't alone. He still wanted to at least make the people think that he was a regular mage. The German shepherd-sized ants continued to pour through the corridor towards them. They all looked the same, and they tried to swarm the party of 5 with their superior numbers. Luckily, the party they were facing was prepared. Orson backed up Dalrak at the front while Hels, I and her elven companion used their bows as support. These smaller worker ants didn't seem to have a hard enough armor to protect themselves from the arrows. They were held off at the helm by a large halberd and shield along with a two-handed sword that the human warrior was wielding. Just as Roland expected, Orson was having trouble swinging his large sword around. He even found himself having to shove an ant away while using his thick sword blade as an impromptu shield. Fortunately, he had a robust dwarf by his side that could thrust his polearm weapon as well as swing it around thanks to his high strength and thick arms. The most shocking part of this encounter was the young mage in the party. He revealed himself to be quite the credit to his team. Each of his spells landed on an ant's head, killing in one shot each time. With his help, the surge of ants was safely dispatched, and soon 20 or so corpses lay on the coal mine floor. Damn, I didn't even get to each chance to show off good going laddie. Damn, I didn't even get the chance to show off good going boy. Roland scratched his cheek a bit. He might have overdone it with the mana bolt spam. He moved himself all the way to the back so his party members probably didn't see him using the scrolls instead of casting himself. Luckily, everyone was far too busy with focusing on the monsters than on the boy caster. They also probably didn't have enough experience with having mages in their party, as those mostly appeared after finishing the magic academies, and were at tier 2. No shit, was killing monsters always so easy with a mage in a party? No wonder everyone wants one around. Before his party could examine his battle style any further, he gave out a cough. I think we should gather up the mana stones. I can feel that there are 5 of them here. Some of them recalled that mages were able to feel the monster cores in the slain monsters thanks to their mana sense. They quickly dissected the monster ants. Their feelers and mandibles could be sold for some coin to alchemists. Even the armor could fetch a penny and be made into some lesser armor. These adventurers were mostly driven by monetary gains, so they started gathering the loot. They had to give up on the ant armor, as there were just too many of them, and no one had a storage bag large enough to fit all of those carcasses in. Hells, I was the only one from the party without one of those bags, so she pouted while seeing her temporary companions packing up everything. Don't worry, if you work long enough you'll be able to afford one of the cheaper ones. Roland gave the half-gnome a reassuring look as he noticed that she was feeling down. Bags cost a lot if you were a bronze rank, but were somewhat affordable after getting through that hump. Who's worrying? She turned her head embarrassed about her lack of adventurer gear, and that she was considered poor. Her companions didn't really care as they all were in similar situations when they were starting out. Some of them even had to work as regular hired help when they were starting out as no one wanted them around without any combat experience. There weren't really that many people that could evade the simple labor missions like Roland did when he started out. The ones that tried too soon ended up as goblin food. Keech ants weren't that tough, think we can continue. These ants weren't that tough, think we can continue, Dalrak proclaimed while getting some of the ant juices out of his halberd. It was a surprise to find out that this mine was overrun by ant monsters. This didn't mean that they should retreat just yet. The more of these butters they slew, the more money they would get. They just needed to gather up their feelers and mandibles as proof. Yeah, we also have the mage kid with us, it should be a breeze. Orson was somehow invigorated after seeing the spell-slinging capabilities of his new party member. The elf also nodded in Hells. I just shrugged as she was here to gain some experience points. She could already see that it was increasing at a rapid pace while they defeated these weak monsters. She had already gained 1 level just after this quick battle. Don't see a reason not to. Roland also nodded. The path behind them was mapped out by them. They had a clear path to retreat, and the ants didn't seem to be digging up new tunnels that much. With the current strategy of the 2 warriors in the front and 3 range attackers in the back, they felt reassured. They still had enough time to backtrack as the 5-hour time limit wasn't up. They continued on. Roland spotted a larger cavern on the map. This cavern was probably some kind of larger mining area that the people dug out. He expected to find some minecarts along with more paths opening for them to investigate. They followed the railroad tracks all the way to it. While heading forward they encountered more of the worker ants. Roland was still quite greedy and was sure to always aim for the head. The other party members didn't really need to do much besides blocking the ants' path while their backline fighters pelted them with arrows and spells. The archers of the group were sure to gather up the arrows, as they could be reused. The path ahead continued to be bathed in darkness. Roland even brought out a second orb of light. The ants kept appearing periodically, but in small numbers, as if guided by the smell of their fallen brethren. It was rumored that the ants communicated with each other by pheromones or some kind of chemical trails, which made a lot of sense. The party finally came to the end of one of the long corridors, and was greeted by a large cavern. There was abandoned mining equipment scattered here, pickaxes on the ground, and minecarts filled with raw iron ore. The bright blue light illuminated the whole place, and they could hear the familiar sound of clicking mandibles of the ants. The smaller worker ant variants weren't the only ones there. There was a slightly bigger variant of those monsters, but luckily, it wasn't a Tier 2 soldier variant. This was just an advanced version of the worker. Its larger body size brought an increase in the size of their mandibles, and also another deadly aspect. Mana shield. Roland was quick to react. During his times in libraries, he had studied about the various monsters in the kingdom. He knew about some of the ant monster types having acid, like spit. This acid was now sizzling and dripping down from a shield that he placed on Orson. He was slow on the uptake as he was wrestling with 3 smaller ants. Watch out for their spit. It has limited uses. Duck for some cover until it runs out, Roland shouted while using up one of his mana arrow scrolls on the other larger worker ant. This one didn't go down after one hit. The mana arrow only managed to leave a deep crack in its carapace. It already showed more resilience than the basic worker ant. Helse, I and Cylinder ducked behind the large mine carts while Dalrak and Orson backed away, their gazes focusing on the acid-spitting ants. One of the acid shots connected with the cart Helse. I was hiding behind. Fortunately, it wasn't quite strong enough to eat through the thick iron. With a couple more mana bolts and mana arrows, the 2 long-range attackers drew their last breaths. Party members then jumped in to clear out the easier workers. Orson leaned forward while panting. The battle was over, but the stuffy mine air was getting to him. The other party members were also tired. The time they spent here was already over 2 hours. A decision about retreating, for now, would probably be the best course of action. I think we should return, laddies. Yes, think we should return, guys. Everyone nodded, and looked to Roland to point out the mana stones of the ant monsters. They would quickly gather up the loot and go back. They feared that more ant monsters would be coming. No one knew how the other parties were doing either. They needed to return and ask their expedition leader about a new plan of action. Things wouldn't be going their way, as the moment they were finished with taking their spoils, they heard a rumble. The whole mine began shaking around, as if some kind of explosion occurred. They could even hear some kind of loud noise. Everyone started jumping around the wider cavern, as the ceiling started falling apart. Large rocks were dropping all over the place and everyone was doing their best at evading. The rumbling and sudden earthquake didn't last for long, but when the smoke cleared they saw a large problem. By Solaria's tits, the passage collapsed. Orson was the first one to notice the corridor through which they came was now blocked off by large boulders. This was an amount that they couldn't clear out in a short amount of time. The miners outside wouldn't venture inside and help them either. They were trapped with the only choice of moving forward into the ant-infested tunnels that lay ahead.